The chain came up out of the earth on a Tuesday morning in April, attached to nothing Jesse Calloway could explain. He almost missed it. The sun was still low behind a bank of cloud when he climbed onto the tractor that morning, and the field ahead of him was the same long brown stretch of worked soil he had turned every spring for 32 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He wasn't looking for anything unusual. He was doing what a man does at the start of a planting season, moving forward, row by row, hoping the land would cooperate one more time. The old plow caught on something at the far end of the South 40, and the John Deere lurched and shuddered, and Jesse cut the engine before the drag pulled him sideways across the field. When he climbed down and walked back to see what had snagged the blade, he found a length of chain. Not a fence chain. Not the kind of light, galvanized links you'd string between posts to hold a gate. This chain was something different, heavy, hand-forged, each individual link as thick as a man's thumb, dark with rust, and slick with the cold clay that clung to everything in the South 40 after a wet winter. One end of it disappeared back into the earth at a shallow angle, descending into a gap the plow blade had opened up. The other end was coiled twice around the blade's shoulder and had nearly bent the steel. Jesse stood in the wind that comes off the Kansas plains like it has somewhere to be, and looked at the chain for a long time. He didn't know yet what he was looking at. He didn't know that this particular Tuesday in April was the last ordinary morning of his life. But some part of him, the part that had worked this ground for 3 decades and knew every rock and root and broken piece of the earth under his feet, understood that this was different. That this was not an accident of geology or old farm debris. That something had been put here, deliberately, by human hands. And that it had been waiting. To understand what the chain meant to Jesse Calloway, you have to understand what the land meant to him first. The Calloway farm sat 3 miles east of a small town called Harlan, in the flat, wide country of western Kansas, where the sky is bigger than anything else and the horizon runs in every direction until it disappears into heat and distance. 412 acres. Most of it wheat, some of it corn in the wet years. A few acres near the creek kept as pasture for the small herd of cattle Jesse ran mainly out of habit and family loyalty rather than any real profit motive. His grandfather, Thomas Calloway, had broken the first ground on that land in 1934, the worst year of the Dust Bowl, when most men were leaving the plains rather than arriving on them. Thomas had come out of Oklahoma with $40 and a wife named Ruth and a determination that his family would have land of their own land that nobody could take from them. He had worked soil that other men called worthless. He had planted in years when the rains didn't come. He had lost crops to hail and heat and locusts, and planted again the following spring and the spring after that. And by the time his son Robert took over the farm in 1968, the Calloway land was producing enough wheat to matter. Robert had expanded it, bought the adjacent parcels when neighbors sold out during the agricultural crisis of the late 70s, when interest rates climbed past 20% and the banks started collecting farms the way a collector acquires things he never intends to use. Robert had been careful about debt, or maybe just fortunate. He had borrowed only when he had to, paid back early when he could, and by the time Jesse came of age and started working the land alongside his father in the early 90s, the Calloway farm was among the older, better-established operations in that part of the county. Jesse had never wanted to be anything other than what he was. He had gone to the state agricultural college, studied agronomy for 2 years, then come home because the land pulled at him in a way that was hard to explain to people who hadn't grown up with their hands in it. There was something about being the 3rd generation on the same soil, knowing that his grandfather had stood in these same fields and watched these same sunsets, that gave the work a weight beyond the purely practical. He wasn't just growing wheat. He was continuing something. He met Sarah Whitfield at the county fair in the summer of 1998. She was from a farm family herself, 2 counties over, and she had none of the romanticized notions about agricultural life that sometimes attract people who then discover the reality is considerably harder than the idea. Sarah knew what farming was. She knew it was mornings that began before light and evenings that ended after dark, and long seasons of worry between planting and harvest, and years when everything went right and years when everything went wrong, and the difference between them was mostly just weather. She married Jesse anyway, in a small ceremony at the Methodist church in Harlan. with her family's farm quilt hung behind the altar and a reception in the town hall that went until midnight. Their son Danny was born in 2007, a late child, the one they had stopped hoping for and then been given anyway. Sarah said he arrived in the world looking for an argument, because he was born with a frown and his fists already clenched, and he had never entirely stopped. He grew up on the farm the way Jesse had grown up on it, knowing every acre, every low spot, every corner that flooded in the spring, and every ridge that dried out first in the summer. By 12, he could drive the tractor. By 14, he could work through most basic mechanical failures without consulting a manual. And then Sarah got sick. It happened the way those things tend to happen quietly at first, then all at once. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February of 2022, and by November of that same year, she was buried on the small rise at the north edge of the property where she had always said she wanted to be, where you could see the wheat coming up in the spring and the whole width of the Kansas sky all year around. Jesse planted a cedar tree over her grave and visited it every morning before he started work. That was his only ritual, the only thing that held the grief at a manageable distance and made the rest of the day possible. He would walk up the low rise with his coffee, stand beside the cedar, and tell her what he was planning to do that day. Sometimes he talked about Danny. Sometimes he just stood there watching the light change over the fields and said nothing at all. Danny had not handled losing his mother at 15 in a way that anybody could have called healthy. The particular shape of his grief was a withdrawal that worried Jesse deeply. The boy went quiet in a way that had nothing peaceful in it. He stopped talking about the things he had cared about, stopped bringing friends around, stopped doing much beyond the farm work that needed doing and the schoolwork that was demanded of him. He was present and absent at the same time, and Jesse didn't know how to reach him. He was honest enough with himself to admit that his own grief wasn't helping. The farm kept Jesse moving through those first 2 years. The routine of it, the machinery that needed maintaining, the soil that needed turning, the crops that required tending, gave him a structure to work through each day, and movement was the only thing that prevented the worst of the loss from settling permanently in his chest. He worked more hours than he should have and ate less than he should have, and slept roughly half what a man his age needed. And by the second spring after Sarah's death, he was a thinner, harder, quieter version of the man he had been, running the farm on discipline and stubbornness, while the larger financial picture grew steadily worse in ways he wasn't fully facing. The drought had started in 2021, the year before Sarah died, and it had never properly ended. Western Kansas had seen below-average rainfall for 3 consecutive years, the kind of sustained dry stretch that doesn't kill a farm in one season but drains it slowly, the way a slow leak drains a tank. Jesse's wheat yields had dropped by 30% the first year, 40% the second. The corn he had planted in the lowland acres had failed almost entirely in the summer of 2023, and he had been forced to sell a portion of the cattle herd to cover the gap between what the land produced and what the operating costs demanded. He had taken on debt to do it. Not recklessly. He hadn't done anything his grandfather would have considered reckless borrowing against the land's assessed value to bridge a rough stretch, trusting that the weather would eventually turn. But the loan he had taken from Midwest Agricultural Credit in 2022 had come due for its first major repayment in the winter of 2023, and the repayment was larger than he had anticipated, and the second one due in the spring of 2024 was larger still. The banker was a man named Ted Hargrove. He ran the agricultural lending division out of an office in Dodge City and drove a truck that was too clean for a man who claimed to understand farming, and he had a way of speaking about Jesse's situation that was precise and impersonal, as if the farm were a spreadsheet entry rather than the accumulated work of 3 generations. Hargrove had driven out to the property in January with a summary of Jesse's loan status and a timeline that left no room for interpretation. 90 days. That was what Jesse had. If he couldn't bring the loan current by the end of April, not paid off, just current Midwest Agricultural Credit would begin foreclosure proceedings. The land itself, 412 acres that Thomas Calloway had pulled out of the Dust Bowl, would be sold. Hargrove had delivered this information sitting at the kitchen table where Jesse had eaten breakfast with Sarah every morning for 20 years. He had then looked around the kitchen with an expression that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't quite neutral either, and he had said, standing to leave, "You've got a good piece of ground. Somebody will farm it." Jesse had walked him out to his truck without saying a word. After Hargrove left, He had gone up to the cedar tree in the cold January light and stood there a long time. He didn't tell Sarah about the foreclosure. He told her about the way the frost had come in hard the night before and how the wheat looked silver in the early morning, and about how Danny had said something at dinner that had nearly made him smile, and about how the old John Deere was running rough again and he would need to look at the fuel injection system before planting season arrived. Then he had gone back down to the house and made coffee and opened the kitchen drawer where he kept the farm's financial records and sat with the numbers until it was too dark to see them clearly, looking for something he already knew wasn't there. There were other pressures, too, beyond the bank. A company called Meridian Land Holdings had been acquiring farms across that part of the county for the past 3 years, consolidating smaller operations into what their brochures called integrated agricultural production units, and what the county's older farmers called buying up everything in sight. Meridian had approached Jesse twice already. The first time, 18 months ago, he had declined politely. The second time, 6 months after that, he had been less polite. The representative Meridian sent was named Carl Devereaux, about 40, well-dressed in the particular way of men who want to appear as if they understand rural life without actually living it, with a habit of looking at the horizon while he talked, as if already imagining what the land would look like under different management. The second time he came, Devereaux had said something that stayed with Jesse long afterward. "Mr. Calloway," he had said, standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets, "this land has been farmed to its limit. 3 bad years in a row doesn't mean you've had bad luck. It means the land itself is telling you something. Some properties are worth considerably more as investments than as working farms." Jesse had asked him to leave and not come back, but the offer was always on the table. Jesse had known for months that if the foreclosure went through, Meridian would be the first in line to buy the land from the bank at whatever it cleared at auction. His grandfather's 412 acres would become a line item in a corporate portfolio. His neighbors had started saying variations of the same thing, in softer and less polished language. The Hendersons, who farmed the section to the north, had sold to Meridian the previous fall. Their son Gary had pulled Jesse aside at the feed store in December and said, quietly and with genuine kindness, "You can fight it for another year or two, Jesse, but the water table isn't coming back and the weather's not turning. Nobody around here is going to think less of you for taking the money." Jesse had thanked him and driven home in silence. The morning Danny had asked at breakfast whether they were going to lose the farm, Jesse had said no. He had said it with the certainty you use when you have nothing to back it up with, when the word comes not from evidence, but from the part of you that simply cannot allow the alternative to be true. Danny had looked at him for a moment with an expression too old for a 17-year-old's face, and then nodded and gone back to his eggs. That was 3 weeks before the chain. In those 3 weeks, Jesse had done what he always did when the situation was bad enough that action felt impossible. He had kept working. He had serviced the equipment for spring planting, patching a hydraulic line on the plow attachment and replacing the worn bearings on the grain drill. He had checked the fence lines, replaced 40 feet of wire along the south pasture where the winter had stretched, and snapped it. He had applied for a drought assistance program through the state agricultural department and been told he was on a waiting list. He and Danny had eaten dinner together most evenings without talking much. Danny was decent at silence. He had gotten that from his mother, who could share a room with you for an hour without the absence of conversation feeling like a problem. Jesse was less comfortable with it, but he had learned to sit in it rather than fill it with things that didn't need to be said. Twice Danny had asked questions about the planting schedule, practical questions about soil prep and seed variety selection, and Jesse had answered them carefully and at length, because those conversations were the thread between them right now, the only reliable ground they shared, and he was not going to take them for granted. One evening Danny had come into the kitchen while Jesse was looking at the field maps and sat down across from him without being invited and looked at the maps for a while in silence. Then he had said, "What's under here?" and pointed to the South 40. Jesse had said he wasn't sure. Just old ground. Danny had looked at the map for another moment and then gone to bed. Jesse had thought about that question more than once in the weeks that followed. What's under here? He had answered it the way he would have answered it any other year, with the assumption of clay and rock and groundwater and the ordinary ancient geology of the Kansas plains. He had not had any reason to answer it differently. Until the chain. Before the sun was fully up, with Jesse dressed, and in the kitchen before the coffee had finished brewing. He stood at the window while it percolated, looking out at the yard. The sky in the east was just beginning to separate from the land, a faint pale line distinguishing where the earth ended and where the darkness continued upward. The yard was bare and brown. The old grain bins at the north edge of the property caught a faint glint of early light on their curved metal sides. The John Deere sat in the open equipment bay where he had parked it the night before after checking the plow attachment, its green paint gone gray in the early dimness. He had been running through numbers in his sleep again. Not consciously, not like a man working at a problem, just the way anxious arithmetic seeps into sleep and leaves you more tired when you wake than when you lay down. The loan balance, the amount that would bring it current, the difference between what he had and what he needed, which was a gap that had not changed much since January and was not going to change on its own. There was one option left that he hadn't taken. He could plant the South 40. The South 40 was the piece of ground his grandfather had called the difficult patch and his father had called the money loser, and that Jesse himself had left fallow for the past 4 years after a series of crop failures that had made it seem more trouble than it was worth. The soil there ran heavy with clay. It drained poorly. It compacted in the summer and cracked and heaved in the winter cycles, and the water table under it behaved differently than the rest of the property in ways that no soil report had ever fully explained. Yields from the South 40, when Jesse had bothered to plant it, had reliably come in at 60 to 70% of what comparable ground produced. But he needed acres this spring. He needed every bushel he could get out of the ground, and leaving 40 acres unplanted when he was facing a foreclosure deadline was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had decided the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with the field rotation maps spread out in front of him, that he would work the South 40. Turn it over, check the drainage, plant winter wheat, and hope for a late-season run. He was not particularly hopeful about it. He didn't have the energy for hope right now. He was just going to do the work that needed doing and see what happened. Before he poured the coffee into his thermos, he stood for a moment at the counter and looked at the photograph Sarah had hung on the kitchen wall the second year they were married, a picture of his grandfather Thomas standing in a wheat field, taken sometime in the late 40s, his hat pushed back on his head and his forearms dark from the sun, and a look on his face that was not quite a smile, but was something close to satisfaction. A man who had found the thing he was supposed to be doing. Jesse had always assumed that expression was about the wheat, about the land, about having survived the Dust Bowl and the Depression and built something on the other side of them. He looked at it now and tried to read something else in his grandfather's face and found nothing. The photograph gave back nothing but the image of a man standing in a field in the Kansas summer, squinting against the light. He pulled on his canvas jacket and went out. The air outside was cold in the way April mornings get cold in western Kansas, not the bone-deep cold of January, but the raw, damp cold that comes with spring and feels, somehow, less forgiving for its unexpectedness. The mud in the yard was partially frozen on top and soft underneath, and his boots broke through the surface layer with each step. Bishop, the old border collie who had been Sarah's dog originally, and was now the farm's dog in a loose, practical sense, appeared from the equipment bay and fell into step beside him without any particular enthusiasm. Jesse crossed the yard to the tractor, climbed up, and turned the key. The engine coughed and caught and settled into its rough idle, blowing a thin cloud of exhaust into the cold air. He let it warm for 5 minutes, hands on his knees, watching the sky brighten in the east. Somewhere out along the north fence line, a meadowlark was already singing. That sound had always seemed to Jesse like the land's way of announcing itself, not the land of drought and debt and failed crops, but the other one, the older one, the one that had been here before any Calloway and would be here after. He put the tractor in gear and headed for the South 40. The drive to the South 40 took 7 minutes by the route that followed the fence line along the east edge of the property, through the low gap in the windbreak, and down the 2-track that ran along the creek. Jesse made this drive slowly, partly to spare the tractor's front axle on the rough track, and partly because he always drove slowly along this stretch. The creek was lower than it should have been in April, lower than it had been when he was a boy, and this was a reliable watercourse rather than an intermittent one. The cottonwoods along its banks were just coming into leaf, the small new leaves bright and yellow-green against the old gray bark. A pair of red-tailed hawks worked the air above the woodlet in wide, easy circles, riding the first thermals of the warming morning. Sarah had loved those hawks. She had tracked the pairs that nested in the woodlet across the years, giving them informal names based on distinguishing marks and keeping a loose mental record of their territories. It was one of the particular things he had learned about her only after they married that she paid close attention to the farm's wildlife, not in a systematic way, but in the way of someone who found the non-human inhabitants of a piece of land as interesting and worth knowing as the human ones. After she died, Jesse had found himself looking at the hawks more often than he used to. He wasn't sure what he was looking for in them. Something that had survived the winter. Something still here, past the creek and the small woodlet that grew along its banks, in a section that got full sun by mid-morning and was protected from the worst of the northwest wind by the low ridge that ran along its western edge. From the road you couldn't see it. From the farmhouse, you could just catch the far corner of it when the trees along the creek were bare. It was, in most practical respects, the most isolated piece of the farm, the piece that felt most removed from the rest of the operation. Jesse had not worked this ground in 4 years. As he cleared the woodlet and came around the end of the creek bed and the South 40 opened up in front of him, he felt the particular quality of attention that comes from looking at something that has been left alone for a while. The field had gone rough. Grass and volunteer wheat, and what looked like a fair stand of foxtail, had colonized the surface. The drainage furrows he had dug years ago along the eastern edge were partially collapsed. The soil would need to be worked hard before it would take seed. He lowered the plow and started the first pass. The ground was heavier than he remembered. The clay content was pulling at the blade on every stroke, the kind of resistance that builds up in your shoulders over a long morning and reminds you of joints you had forgotten about. He worked the first half of the field without incident, turning the dead grass under, working the surface to a rough tilth that caught the strengthening morning light and held it in a way that was, despite everything, almost beautiful. Fresh-turned earth has a smell and a texture and a particular quality of presence that no other surface quite matches. Whatever else this land was, a failing enterprise, a financial liability, a piece of property that a bank intended to take from him in 90 days, it was also this, dark and alive, turning over under the blade the way it had turned over for his grandfather and his father before him. He came around the south end of the field and started the third pass from east to west, the sun now well up and beginning to cut some of the cold out of the air. Bishop had settled at the field's edge near the woodlet and was watching the tractor with the patient attention dogs give to things they find mildly interesting and not worth chasing. Jesse was thinking about the drainage furrows along the east side and whether he should recut them before planting. And he was thinking about the soil sample results from 3 years ago that had suggested the clay content in this part of the field might respond to a lime application. And he was thinking, at a low level, the way he always thought in this part of the farm, about the unusual way the ground behaved down here, the way it seemed to settle differently than the rest of the property, the way the drainage never quite made sense. He was not thinking about anything underground. He was never thinking about underground when the plow hit the chain. The blade caught it at the north end of the third pass, about 60 feet from the field's edge, in a section where the soil ran particularly heavy and dark. The impact was different from hitting a rock or an old piece of buried equipment. There was a hard snag followed by a sound that traveled up through the tractor frame, a deep metallic note that Jesse felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. The John Deere's front end dipped slightly as the plow bit into the resistance and found it immovable, and Jesse got the engine cut before the torque could do anything worse. He sat on the tractor for a moment in the sudden quiet, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal and the wind across the field and the distant meadowlark that had apparently decided to follow him to the South 40. Then he climbed down. He walked back along the plow's path to the point of impact. The blade had opened up a rough furrow about 18 inches deep before catching, and the chain was there, clearly visible against the dark clay, already partially exposed where the steel had torn away the soil around it. Jesse crouched down beside it and looked. He looked for a long time. The chain was old. He could see that immediately, not just weathered, but genuinely old, the kind of age that changes the fundamental character of metal rather than just its surface appearance. The links were hand-forged, not machine-cut, each one slightly irregular in a way that spoke of individual craftsmanship rather than industrial manufacture. They were roughly octagonal in cross-section, the edges worn smooth by time, the surface a deep uniform rust that in the light had the texture and color of dried blood. Each link was approximately 4 inches long and nearly 2 inches across, the iron itself perhaps an inch thick. This was heavy chain, the kind of chain you would use not to hold something, but to secure it. He thought about how long a piece of metal had to sit in the ground before it looked like this. Not years, decades. He thought about the last time he had worked this ground 4 years ago, and whether he would have found it then if the plow had run deep enough. He thought about his father running the same field for 30 years before that, and his grandfather for 30 years before his father. None of them had ever mentioned a chain. Jesse reached down and took hold of the nearest link with his right hand and pulled. The chain did not move. He pulled harder, planting his boots in the loose soil and putting his back into it, and the chain shifted perhaps half an inch in the direction he was pulling and then stopped as if it were rooted to the center of the earth. He straightened up and looked at the point where the chain disappeared into the ground. The plow had exposed maybe 3 feet of it, running at a shallow downward angle into the clay before vanishing at the edge of the furrow. There was no way to tell how far down it went. There was no way to tell what it was attached to. Jesse stood there with clay on his hands and the wind at his back and the sun overhead climbing toward 9 o'clock, and he made the decision that would change his life. He went back to the equipment bay and got a shovel. He drove back to the South 40, parked the tractor at the field's edge, and started digging. The first hour of digging told him several things. The chain went deeper than he had initially estimated. The angle of descent flattened out at around 3 feet below the surface, shifting from approximately 30 degrees to something close to horizontal, which suggested that whatever the chain was attached to was not directly below the point where it entered the ground, but further away, likely further to the west, in the direction the chain ran. The soil around it was different from the surrounding field, denser and more compressed, with a quality of settlement that suggested it had been disturbed and then packed down at some point in the past. Not geological disturbance. Human disturbance. The second thing he noticed was the size. He had thought the links looked large when he first saw them, but as he dug and exposed more of the chain, he began to recalibrate his sense of its scale. These links were not just heavy for a chain. They were, by any practical standard, enormous. They were the kind of links you would find on anchor chain for a large ship or on the massive lifting gear of an industrial crane. They had no business being in an agricultural field in western Kansas. The third thing he noticed, and the thing that made him stop digging and stand very still for a moment in the April sun, was what the chain was lying on. At 4 feet below the surface, as he worked his way west along the chain's path, his shovel began to hit something flat and hard. Not rock. The sound was wrong for rock, and the texture, when he cleared the soil from it, was wrong. Rock doesn't echo. Rock doesn't give back the tap of a shovel blade with a hollow ring that rises up through the handle into your palms. Jesse got down on one knee and cleared the soil from the area with his hands, working carefully, the way you work when you are not entirely sure what you are uncovering. What he found was metal. Plate steel, from the look and feel of it, thick, flat, and though rusted on its surface, fundamentally intact beneath the rust. He cleared a section about 2 feet square and sat back on his heels and looked at it. This was not a piece of farm equipment. It was not a buried vehicle or a scrap metal pile or any of the ordinary things that turn up in old agricultural land. The steel was too thick, too regular, too obviously intentional in its placement. It had been put here. It was part of something. Jesse stood up and looked out across the South 40. The field was quiet around him, the wind moving through the turned soil, Bishop watching from the woodland edge with alert ears. The tractor sat at the field's edge where he had left it, patient and indifferent. He thought about his grandfather, who had broken this ground in 1934 and farmed it for 30 years afterward and had called it the difficult patch, without ever explaining exactly why. He thought about the way the drainage in this section had never behaved the way drainage should, the way the soil compaction had always been heavier here than elsewhere, the way the South 40 had consistently underperformed the rest of the property in ways that a soil analysis could only partially account for. He picked up the shovel again. He widened the excavation, working in a careful grid pattern outward from the point where the chain met the flat steel surface, clearing soil methodically, following the contours of what was emerging beneath him. He worked for another 2 hours without stopping. By noon, he had uncovered an area approximately 8 feet square. The plate steel beneath his boots was a lid, or a door, or a roof. He couldn't tell which yet. It was continuous across the entire 8-foot section he had cleared, without joints or seams, a single piece of heavy-gauge steel that had been engineered to bear significant weight, the weight of soil, of time, of 30 years of crops planted and harvested above it. Along its edges, where the steel met what appeared to be a concrete frame sunk deep into the surrounding ground, he found the anchor points where the chain was fixed. Not one chain, two. He had found one of them with the plow blade. The other ran parallel to it, fixed to a ring bolt on the opposite side, still buried. Two chains, fixed to the same steel door. And the door, he had come to think of it as a door now. A certainty that had settled into him without quite being processed through any conscious reasoning was large. Larger than anything he could have expected when he first pulled the chain free of the soil that morning. 8 feet by, he estimated, at least 12, maybe more. He had not yet reached the far edge. He stood at the center of what he had uncovered and looked down at the rusted steel and the hollow sound it gave back when he tapped it with his boot, and the way the chain lay across its surface like something placed there rather than something accidental. And he felt the particular quality of silence that falls over a place when the ordinary world has stepped aside for something else. Danny would be home from school at 3:30. Jesse checked his watch. He had time. He went back to the equipment bay, got the heavy breaker bar and a second shovel and the longer chain from the fence repair kit, and drove back out to the South 40. He was not going to stop digging. He understood that clearly, the way you understand things that have moved beyond decision into necessity. Whatever was under the South 40, whatever his grandfather had planted crops on top of for 30 years, and whatever his father had farmed above for another 30 after that, it had been here through all of it. Waiting, as things placed underground will wait, with the patience of objects that have no relationship with time. By 2 in the afternoon, Jesse had exposed the full surface of the door. It was 14 feet wide and 10 feet across, a rectangle of heavy steel plate set into a concrete collar that descended into the earth at a depth he could not yet determine. The 2 chains were fixed to ring bolts at either end of the door's long axis, each chain running downward at a slight angle before disappearing under the door's edge, suggesting they were attached to something below, not locks but counterweights, perhaps, or anchor points that held the door in its frame against pressure from underneath. The concrete collar was old but solid, its surface stained dark with decades of moisture and mineral deposit, with no significant cracking. Whoever had built this had built it to last. Whoever had buried it had known that the thing they were hiding would need to survive not just years, but generations. Jesse stood at the edge of what he had uncovered and looked at the steel door and thought about his grandfather. Thomas Calloway had come to this land in 1934. He had been 26 years old. He had lived on this property until his death in 1979. He had called the South 40 the difficult patch and told his son not to expect much from it, and had never, in all the years Jesse could remember, said anything specific about why. What had he known about this? What had he been keeping? Jesse ran his boot across the surface of the steel and felt the solid mass beneath him, the engineered weight of something that had been built to keep the world out or to keep something in. The hollow sound came back up through his boot sole, and below it, barely perceptible, almost imagined, something that might have been a resonance. The kind of resonance an enclosed space makes when you tap its ceiling. He stood with that thought for a long moment in the April sun, with the wind moving across the South 40 and Bishop watching from the woodlet, and the whole quiet, ordinary weight of the Kansas afternoon pressing down on him. Then he knelt beside the nearest chain ring and started looking for a way to open the door. The ring bolt was large, 6 inches across, threaded into a socket that had been set into the concrete collar with what appeared to be lead packing, the old way of waterproofing a fastener before modern sealants existed. The surface of the bolt had corroded, but the thread engagement beneath was likely still sound. Jesse worked at it with the breaker bar for 20 minutes before he got any movement, and then another 10 before he understood that the ring bolt was not itself a release mechanism, but a tie-down point. Whatever opened the door, it was not this. He worked around the full perimeter of the door's edge, clearing soil from the concrete collar, looking for a latch or handle or hinge point. He found the hinges on the south end, 4 of them, massive cast-iron pivots, one above the other, running along the door's short edge. The door opened from the north. Then, if it opened at all, he cleared the soil from the north edge and found, buried beneath 6 inches of clay, an iron pull bar running horizontally across the door's width, fixed to a pair of brackets that he could feel were spring-loaded against the door's surface. A handle. An old, heavy, deliberately buried handle. Jesse wrapped both hands around the pull bar and braced his feet against the concrete collar and pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. The pull bar did not move. The door did not move. The only thing that happened was that the muscles in his lower back sent him a clear message about what they thought of this activity. He sat back and breathed and thought. The door was not locked. He could see that now that he had the collar cleared, there was no external lock mechanism, no chain across the seam, no padlock or bar. The door was simply heavy. Tremendously, extraordinarily heavy, heavier than its surface area alone could account for, which meant the steel was either much thicker than it appeared or there was additional weight on the other side, holding it closed from below. He remembered the chains. The way they ran at a slight downward angle from the ring bolts into the gap under the door's edge. Not counterweights. Tie-down chains on the inside of the door, connected through the collar to the ring bolts on the outside. Someone had sealed this door from the inside. That thought was so strange, so contrary to what he had been expecting, that Jesse sat with it for a full minute before he could think past it. Someone had sealed this door from the inside, which meant there was a way out other than this door. Which meant whatever was below the South 40 of the Calloway farm was not a simple sealed vault, but a structure with more than one access point. Jesse looked at the field around him. The South 40 was 400 feet wide and roughly 1,000 feet long. He was standing near the north end. The rest of the field spread out to the south, flat and featureless, the turned soil from his morning's plowing catching the afternoon light. He stood up slowly, his knees aching, and looked at the field for a long time. Somewhere under the South 40, there was another way in. His watch said 3:15. Danny's bus would be at the end of the drive in 15 minutes. Jesse looked at the open excavation at his feet, the rusted steel door with its massive chain rings, the concrete collar with its old lead-packed bolts. He looked at the 14 feet of engineered steel that someone had buried under 30 feet of topsoil and left for the land to grow over. He thought about his grandfather breaking ground here in 1934. He thought about the difficult patch. He thought about 30 years of crops planted above this steel door, 30 years of footsteps and seasons and weather, and whatever was underneath all of it, waiting in the dark. He picked up the shovel. Danny's bus could wait 5 more minutes. He pressed the shovel blade into the soil at the south end of the excavation, beyond the edge of the door, and started working in the direction the structure would have to run if it had another entrance. The shovel hit resistance at 14 inches. Not chain this time. Not steel plate. Jesse cleared the soil from around it carefully, using his hands as much as the shovel, until he had exposed enough to understand what he was looking at. Concrete steps, descending into the earth at a steep angle, running south away from the door. Each step was wider than any residential construction he had ever worked around, and the concrete was old but intact, its surface smooth and dark with the compressed moisture of decades. Jesse Calloway stood at the top of the buried staircase and looked down into the darkness below the South 40 of his grandfather's farm, and the wind came off the plains and moved. Roughed the turned soil around him, and somewhere out along the fence line the meadowlark was still singing, and everything that had been true about his life that morning, the debt, and the foreclosure, and the 90 days and the land that someone else intended to take from him was still true. But the world had shifted on its axis. Something was down there. Something his grandfather had known about. Something his grandfather had planted crops above and said nothing about for 40 years. Something his father had farmed over for 30 more. Something that had waited in the dark beneath 3 generations of the Calloway family, while the land above it struggled and thrived and struggled again. Jesse reached into his jacket pocket for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut down the concrete steps and disappeared into the dark below. He took the first step down. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The cold hit him before he had gone 4 steps, not the damp cold of the earth near the surface, but a deeper, drier cold. The cold of a space that had been sealed from the world's temperature variations for a very long time. The kind of cold that lives in places that have been forgotten. Jesse paused on the 4th step and held the phone light out in front of him and looked. The staircase descended another 8 steps before it met a floor. The ceiling above him was concrete, poured in a continuous arch that ran from the doorframe he had been working at, Overhead and forward into what he now understood was a substantial underground space. His phone light was small against the scale of what it was trying to illuminate, and the beam ran out before it found the far wall. He went down the remaining steps slowly, watching the ceiling for any sign of structural compromise, listening for the sound of settling or cracking. He heard nothing. The concrete above him was solid. The floor beneath his boots when he reached it was solid too. Concrete again, poured smooth, dusty but uncracked. He stood at the bottom of the staircase and turned the phone light slowly in an arc. The space was roughly the size of the interior of his barn, maybe larger. The ceiling ran at about 8 feet, supported at regular intervals by poured concrete columns that ran floor to ceiling without any decorative element, purely structural, built by someone who cared about function and nothing else. The walls were concrete block on 3 sides and the poured ceiling arch on the 4th. The floor was clear of significant debris, which meant the structure's waterproofing had held a space that leaked would have 40 years of sediment across its floor by now. Jesse moved the phone light across the far wall and stopped. There were things in here. Not rubble, not old equipment, not the kind of accumulated junk that fills the forgotten spaces of old farms. Things that had been placed with intention. He could see shapes along the wall, regular shapes, stacked and organized, the kind of arrangement that speaks of someone who had spent significant time down here and had arranged their belongings with care. The shapes were too orderly for chance. Whatever was in this room, it had been put here by someone who intended it to be found again, or perhaps by someone who intended it never to be found at all. He could not yet tell which. What he could tell, even in the limited sweep of his phone light, was that there was a lot of it. Whatever it was, there was a lot of it. The phone light was not enough. He needed more light. He went back up the steps to get the trouble light from the equipment bay. When he came back down 5 minutes later with the trouble light plugged into the extension cord he had run from the tractor's accessory outlet, the space opened up in front of him in a way the phone light had never allowed. Jesse Calloway stood at the bottom of his grandfather's buried staircase and looked at what was in front of him, and the trouble light hummed and threw its white light across the concrete floor and the concrete walls and the things arranged along them. And what he saw was so far outside the range of anything he had expected to find beneath the South 40 of the Calloway farm that for a long moment he could not move. Along the left wall, wooden crates were stacked 3 high and 4 across, old pine construction with iron strap hardware, the wood darkened by time, but structurally sound. Each one was roughly the size of a large suitcase, and each one was stenciled on its face with black lettering that had faded but remained legible. Along the right wall, metal containers of a different kind, heavier, rounded at their corners, with the look of bank or military storage containers from the mid-20th century, were arranged in a single long row, their locking mechanisms intact, their surfaces filmed with the fine white mineral dust that occurs when moisture tries to pass through concrete and fails. At the far end of the room, beyond the columns, there were shelves, built into the concrete wall itself, recessed and sealed with what appeared to be a thin coat of painted sealant. The shelves held objects he couldn't yet identify clearly from this distance. The room smelled of dry stone and sealed time, the way a room smells when it has held the same air for a very long while. He could only stand there. The meadowlark was still singing somewhere up above him in the April afternoon, and somewhere out on the county road Danny's bus was pulling up to the end of the drive, and none of it seemed to belong to the same world he was standing in. He crossed the floor to the nearest wooden crate and looked at the stenciling on its face. The letters were faded but legible in the trouble light's white glare. His grandfather's name was on every one of them. T. Calloway, Harlan, K.S. He pressed his palm flat against the top of the nearest crate and felt the solid weight of it, the density of something that was not hollow, not empty, not the accumulated junk of a life that had run out of storage space. He was going to need more time down here. A lot more time. He was going to need Danny. He turned back toward the staircase and climbed up into the light. Jesse came up out of the ground into the April afternoon, blinking against the light. He stood at the top of the buried staircase and breathed the open air for a moment, feeling the cold of the underground space still clinging to his jacket and the warmth of the sun on his face in a contrast that was almost disorienting. The South 40 spread around him, the turned soil from the morning's plowing catching the late afternoon light. The trouble light's extension cord ran down the stairs behind him, and the opening in the earth looked, from the outside, like any other excavation a farmer might make in a field. Rough edges, raw clay walls, a hole that had been dug and would eventually be filled again. Danny was at the field's edge. He was standing by the fence with his school bag still over one shoulder, his phone in his hand, watching his father emerge from a hole in the ground with the particular stillness that teenagers use when they are trying to look like they haven't been waiting and are not alarmed. He was 17 and already as tall as Jesse, with Sarah's dark eyes and Jesse's jaw, and the combination of those two things into something that was entirely his own. He had walked across the field without being called. He had seen the excavation from the fence and walked toward it, because the alternative, getting back on the bus and going home, would have required a degree of incuriosity that even his current phase of emotional withdrawal could not sustain. "What did you hit?" Danny asked. Jesse walked toward him across the field. He was covered in clay from the knee down, and his hands were dark with it, and he knew his face probably showed what he was feeling, which was something he couldn't have named precisely. Not excitement. Something deeper and stranger than excitement. "Something I need you to see," Jesse said. "Leave the bag." Danny left the bag by the fence post and followed his father across the field. Jesse walked him through it as they went, the chain snagging the plow blade, the decision to dig, the chain's size and age, the steel door sealed from inside, the staircase. He described it methodically, the way he described mechanical problems, because that was the language he and Danny had built between them, and it was reliable. Danny listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of signal. The boy had inherited his mother's habit of going very quiet when something genuinely interested him. At the edge of the excavation, Danny looked down at the open staircase and the trouble lights cord running into the darkness below and said nothing for a moment. "You went down," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Took the trouble light?" "Yes." "And?" Jesse looked at his son. "I need you to see it. I can't describe what's down there accurately enough." Something shifted in Danny's face, a fraction of an opening in the controlled distance he had been keeping for 2 years. He looked at the hole in the ground, and then at his father, and then back at the hole. "Okay," he said. He dropped to a crouch and then to his knees and went down the first step backward, the way you descend a ladder, testing each concrete step before committing weight to it. Jesse came down after him. At the bottom of the staircase, Jesse handed Danny the trouble light and let his son hold it and look. The room came forward out of the darkness as Danny swept the light across it, the concrete ceiling and its columns, the smooth floor, the far wall with its crates and its metal containers, and the shelved alcove beyond. Jesse watched his son's face rather than the room itself, because he had already seen the room, and what was in Danny's face was something he hadn't seen in 2 years. Full attention. Complete, unguarded, wide-open attention. "Dad," Danny said quietly. "Yeah. What is all this?" "That's what we're going to find out." The wooden crates were stacked on the left wall 3 high, 4 columns across, which made 12 crates in total in the first stack. Behind it, a second stack of the same dimensions was visible in the shadows, and beyond that a third. Jesse had counted, from the bottom of the staircase, at least 4 separate stacks. Perhaps more. The room extended further in the dimness than the trouble light could fully reach. Danny crossed the floor to the nearest crate and crouched in front of it. He held the light close to the stenciling on the front face. T. Calloway Harlan, K.S. He ran his finger along the letters, feeling the indentations in the old wood where the stencil brush had pressed through. The letters were black over the natural pine color, faded but legible, each character roughly 2 inches tall. "Great-grandfather," Danny said. His handwriting on the stamp, I think. I recognized the style of the capital letters. Thomas Calloway had been a precise man. Even in ordinary correspondence, the handful of letters that had been saved in the family records and that Jesse had read as a boy, his capital letters had a particular quality, upright and deliberate, each stroke considered. These matched. "Can we open one?" Danny asked. Jesse hesitated only briefly. The crates had been here for decades and were now his, whatever was in them, by the straightforward fact of inheritance. There was no reason in the world not to open one. And yet he stood there for a moment, aware that opening the first crate was a threshold, that what they found inside would change the nature of what they were standing and transform it from an abstract, extraordinary discovery into a specific one, with weight and dimension and consequence. "Yeah," he said. "Let's open one." The lid was nailed down, the nails old and deep with rust, and Jesse had the pry bar he had brought from the equipment bay. He worked the lid carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside by forcing it. The nails gave one at a time, with the particular groan of old iron releasing its grip on old wood. And when the last nail came free and Jesse lifted the lid, a faint smell rose from the interior, dry and faintly metallic, the smell of something that had been sealed in wood for a very long time. Danny held the trouble light over the open crate. The coins were wrapped in oilcloth, the individual packets tied with cord that had darkened and stiffened over the decades but had held its purpose. Each packet was roughly the size of a thick paperback book. Jesse counted 12 packets in the top layer of the crate, arranged in 3 rows of 4, nested in what appeared to be shredded paper that had compressed over time into a dense brownish mat. He picked up the nearest packet and untied the cord. The oilcloth fell open, and he held the trouble light close and looked at what was in his hands. Gold coins, not the small coins of everyday commerce. These were large, the size of a silver dollar, thick and heavy in the palm, their surfaces still bright beneath a thin film of the oil that had preserved them through however many decades they had been wrapped. Jesse turned the top coin toward the light and read the face. $20, circling the standing figure of Liberty in her robes, her right hand raised, her left holding a torch, the Capitol building in relief behind her. Above her, MCMXXVI. On the reverse, a flying eagle. In God We Trust, United States of America. St. Gaudens double eagles. $20 gold pieces. Struck before 1933, before Franklin Roosevelt had issued the executive order requiring American citizens to surrender their gold coins to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper money. These were the most beautiful coins the United States Mint had ever produced, the ones that collectors and historians and numismatists had been writing about for a century. They were also, depending on their condition and date, worth between $2,000 and $5,000 each in today's market. More for certain dates and mint marks. Considerably more for coins in the pristine condition that these appeared to be in. Jesse had never held a St. Gaudens double eagle before. He had seen photographs of them. The coin was famous enough that even people who weren't collectors knew its name and its reputation, but photographs hadn't prepared him for the actual weight of it in his hand. The specific density of gold that is different from any other metal, heavier than it looks, more present. The image of Liberty on the face was extraordinarily fine, the detail in her robes and the feathers of the eagle on the reverse rendered with a precision that seemed wrong for a coin, wrong for something meant to be spent. Theodore Roosevelt had commissioned this design at the turn of the century because he had thought American coinage was ugly and wanted something worthy of the Republic. He had been right that the existing coins were undistinguished. Augustus St. Gaudens had given him something that outlasted both of them. Jesse turned the coin over in the light. The date 1927. Minted in Philadelphia. He looked at the edge, reeded, clean, not a mark on it. This coin had never been spent, had never passed from hand to hand across a shop counter or jangled in a pocket with lesser change. It had been acquired, wrapped in oilcloth, and put away, and it looked today exactly as it had looked the day it left the mint. He counted the coins in the single packet he had unwrapped. 30 coins in a single oilcloth packet. He looked at the 12 packets in the top layer alone. Then he looked at the full crate. There were 4 layers. He could see the oilcloth edges of the packets in the second layer beneath the packing material. For layers, 12 packets per layer, 30 coins per packet. 1,440 coins in a single crate. At a conservative estimate of $2,000 per coin, that was nearly $3 million. In one crate. Jesse sat back on his heels and looked up at his son's face. Danny was looking at the coin in his father's palm with an expression that was entirely readable, the kind of expression that 17-year-olds make before they remember that they are supposed to be composed. Pure, unfiltered awe. "Dad," Danny said again. And this time the word carried something more. A question, and the beginning of an answer, and the weight of something too large to fit into a single syllable, but trying anyway. "There are at least 4 stacks," Jesse said quietly. 12 crates per stack, if they're all similar. Danny did the arithmetic in his head faster than Jesse had. He was his mother's son. In that respect, Sarah had been quick with numbers in a way that Jesse had always admired and never quite matched. "Millions," Danny said. It came out as a breath rather than a word. "A lot of millions." They were quiet for a moment in the underground room, the trouble light humming, the coins in Jesse's palm catching the light, the smell of old oilcloth and preserved metal around them. Outside, invisible above 2 feet of Kansas soil and the steel door and the concrete collar, the April afternoon was continuing its ordinary business. The wind was still. Coming off the plains, the meadowlark was probably still singing somewhere. The foreclosure deadline was still 61 days away. None of that felt entirely real from down here. Jesse re-wrapped the coin packet carefully and laid it back in the crate, then replaced the lid as best he could without the nails fully reseating. He stood and crossed the room to the right wall where the metal containers were arranged in their long row. These were different from the wooden crates, heavier gauge, military surplus in appearance, with the look of the kind of storage used by the Army during and after the Second World War. Each one was approximately the size of a large toolbox, steel with rounded corners, and a latching mechanism on the front face that used a simple lever system rather than a lock. Jesse worked the lever on the nearest container. It resisted briefly, the mechanism stiff with years of disuse, and then released with a sharp metallic click. Inside, nested in folded canvas, were bundles of paper. Not currency, or not primarily currency. Documents. Jesse lifted the top bundle and unfolded the canvas carefully. Inside was a sheaf of papers held together with a rusted steel clip, the pages protected from moisture by the canvas, but yellowed with age at the edges. The handwriting on the top page was the same as the stencil on the crates. Thomas Calloway's. It was dated September 14, 1939. Jesse carried it to where Danny held the trouble light and read. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The letter began without preamble, the way his grandfather seemed to have done most things without wasted approach, moving directly to what needed to be said. To whoever finds this, whether that is my son Robert or his children or some stranger who has bought this land from my family, I want to explain what is here and how it came to be here, so that the truth of it is understood. My name is Thomas Allen Calloway. I came to this land in Harlan County, Kansas in the spring of 1934 with my wife Ruth and $40 in cash money and the intention of farming. What I am about to describe is the reason I chose this particular land, and the reason I never left it, and the reason I kept a secret from my wife and my son for the entirety of my life on it. I am not proud of the secrecy. I believed it was necessary. The reader will have to decide if I was right. Jesse read slowly, moving through the pages one at a time, Danny at his shoulder reading with him in the pool of the trouble light. The letter went on for 17 pages in Thomas Calloway's careful handwriting, and it told a story that neither Jesse nor Danny had ever heard a word of. In 1928, at 20 years old, Thomas Calloway had gone to work for a man named Elias Marsh, who owned grain elevators and a small bank in the town of Cimarron, in the southwestern part of the state. Marsh was a wealthy man by the standards of that time and placed not a millionaire by Eastern standards, but prosperous, a man who had accumulated land and capital through the commodity boom of the First World War and had continued to do well through the mid-20s. He was also, Thomas wrote, a man who did not trust paper money and had never trusted it, had never trusted banks despite owning one himself, and had spent 20 years converting his paper profits into gold coins at every opportunity. Thomas worked for Marsh for 4 years, doing whatever needed doing, driving, maintaining the grain elevator machinery, managing the loading dock, keeping the Marsh property in repair. He was good with his hands and reliable, and Marsh had trusted him, which was not a distinction Marsh extended to many people. In 1931, when the Depression had fully arrived and the grain elevators business had collapsed and Marsh's bank was failing, Marsh had called Thomas into his office and told him that he could not pay him his back wages in cash money because there was no cash money left. What he could pay him, Marsh said, was gold. Marsh had accumulated, over 30 years of deliberate conversion, a substantial holding of gold coins stored in the Cimarron Bank's vault that he had built with the specific intention of hiding its full contents from his partners, his creditors, and the federal government. When his businesses failed, and his creditors came for everything he had, Marsh made sure the vault's contents were not listed among his declared assets. He was, Thomas wrote without particular judgment, a man who had spent his whole life preparing for exactly the betrayal by circumstance that the Depression represented, and when it came he had executed the plan he had been building for decades with considerable thoroughness. He gave Thomas Calloway 16 wooden crates of gold coins and told him to take them somewhere they would never be found, and to keep them for his own family's future, and to never speak of them to anyone. Then Elias Marsh died of a heart attack 14 days later, leaving no heirs and no will and no record of the 16 crates. Thomas had loaded the crates onto a farm wagon in the middle of a November night and driven them north, and then east, and eventually arrived at the piece of land in Harlan County that he had been considering purchasing for 2 years. He bought it in December of 1933 with the cash he had kept from the sale of everything else he owned. The land was cheap because it was considered marginal. He broke ground in the spring of 1934. In 1935, over the course of a single winter, working alone and at night, and in weather cold enough to guarantee that no neighbor would be curious about activity on his land, Thomas Calloway excavated the space beneath what would become the South 40. He had skills enough for the work. He had helped build the concrete cisterns on the Marsh property and understood reinforced poured construction, and he had access, through legitimate farm supply channels, to all the materials he needed. He built the vault, poured the steps, set the steel door, sealed the chains, and covered the whole thing with 4 feet of packed soil. Then he planted his first wheat crop above it. The 16 original crates, Thomas wrote, had become 48 over the years. Not because he had added to them from outside. The gold law made that impossible until 1974, when possession of gold coins became legal again, and by then Thomas was 66 years old and had been keeping the secret for 40 years and did not know how to stop. The additional crates were Thomas's own addition, assembled over decades of careful, patient accumulation. He had added silver coins, rare paper currency from the early part of the century that he had acquired through estate sales and farm auctions, and eventually, after 1974, a small additional purchase of gold when he could afford it. He had also, the letter said, added something else. Not coins. Jesse turned the last page of the 17-page letter and found it. Folded inside the final page was a single sheet of different paper, newer than the rest, the handwriting slightly less steady, an old man's hand, not a young man's. Dated October 1978, a year before Thomas died. Robert, it began, using his son's name. If you find this before Jesse does, tell him it is all his. He is the one who will stay. You were always meant for something else, and I have always been glad of it for you, though I never said so. Jesse will understand why I kept this here and will know what to do with it. I have faith in the land and in him. Jesse could not read for a moment. He stood holding the paper in the underground room, the trouble light casting its white glow across the letter and the crates and the metal containers, and felt the particular quality of grief that comes not from loss but from being known, from being seen clearly by someone who was no longer there to be thanked for it. His grandfather had known that Jesse would come back, had known that Jesse would stay, had aimed this whole extraordinary secret at him across 40 years and trusted that it would land. Danny, reading over his shoulder, had gone completely still. He knew you, Danny said quietly. Yeah, Jesse said. They stood there for a while without talking. The trouble light hummed. Somewhere above them, through 2 feet of Kansas soil and the steel door and the concrete collar, the April afternoon was moving toward evening, and the light was changing over the South 40, and the old cedar tree on the north rise was beginning to stand out against the darkening sky. Jesse folded the letters carefully and put them inside his jacket. He and Danny went back up the steps into the air. The first thing Jesse did was look at the excavation from outside, assessing the visibility from the road. The county road ran along the east edge of his property about 300 yards from the South 40's edge. From the road you could see the field, but the excavation was in the field's center, and the turned soil around it blended well enough with the general disruption of a spring plowing that a passing driver wouldn't necessarily register it as unusual. Not yet. Another day of activity down here, and it would start to look like something more than routine field work. He needed to think carefully about what came next, about who to tell and when and how, about what the discovery meant legally and practically, and what the right sequence of actions was. He was a farmer, not an attorney. He had never found gold coins buried in a field before. He covered the staircase opening with the largest piece of the steel plate he had cut for the well repair last summer, weighed down at its corners with field stones, and he and Danny walked back to the farmhouse without speaking much, each of them carrying the weight of what they now knew. At the kitchen table, Over the dinner that Danny made scrambled eggs and toast, the 17-year-old's fallback for nights when the proper cooking felt like more than either of them had in them. Jesse told Danny what he was thinking. I need to understand the legal situation before I do anything. Gold coins found on private property belong to the landowner, but there may be reporting requirements. There may be tax implications I don't understand yet. Danny nodded. Processing. And the foreclosure. The foreclosure is still happening on its current timeline. I can't pay the loan off with coins I haven't had appraised and don't have a legal mechanism to sell yet. How long would that take? To find a buyer. For gold coins. I don't know. That's what I need to find out. Jesse pushed his eggs around. I'm also not ready to tell anyone yet. Not Hargrove, not Devereaux, not anyone. Once this is known, we lose control of the story. Danny looked at him across the table. You think someone could try to take it? Jesse thought about Devereaux's careful, horizon-scanning expression and Hargrove's clean truck and the way power tends to move toward money and away from people without it. I think we do this carefully, Jesse said. And I think we start tomorrow by talking to someone who knew my grandfather. The someone Jesse had in mind was Earl Whitmore. Earl Whitmore was 89 years old and had lived in Harlan County his entire life. A fact he mentioned without particular pride, but with the steady satisfaction of someone who has outlasted most objections to their presence. He had farmed the Whitmore place on the county's South Road from 1955 until he retired at 78 and turned it over to his son Keith. And in his retired years, he occupied a chair in the Harlan County Historical Society's back room every Tuesday and Thursday morning with the authority of a man who had been made an institution by sheer longevity. Jesse had known Earl peripherally his whole life, the way you know everyone in a county of 12,000, but had spoken to him seriously only a handful of times, mostly at agricultural meetings and once at the Methodist church in the year after Sarah died. Earl had not offered condolences in the usual way. He had found Jesse standing alone near the coffee urn and said, "The ones who go young, they leave things undone that you have to finish for them. That's the deal. Doesn't seem like a fair deal. Isn't one, but it's the deal." Then he had taken his coffee and gone to sit down. Jesse had thought about that more than once in the years since. He drove to town the next morning and found Earl in his usual chair in the Historical Society's back room, reading a water-stained county atlas from 1924 with the concentration of a man mining it for information rather than nostalgia. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on the county's main street. Its front rooms were presentable enough for school visits. Its back rooms were something else, a dense archive of cardboard boxes and folded maps and document sleeves that smelled of old paper and the dry mustiness of things kept long and carefully. Earl Whitmore had been contributing to that archive for 40 years, depositing farm records and photographs and typed oral histories, and the room had shaped itself around his presence the way rooms do when one person uses them long enough. The chair he sat in was positioned at exactly the angle that suited him. The reference books he reached for most often were within arm's reach without his having to lean. Earl looked up when Jesse came in, assessed him briefly, and said, "You look like a man who slept on something and it didn't improve." He set the atlas down. "Sit." Jesse sat across from him at the work table, pushing aside a stack of property transfer records from the 1940s, and said, without prelude, "Did you know my grandfather? Thomas Calloway. Really know him?" Earl considered the question with the deliberateness of a man who has learned not to answer quickly the questions that deserve slow answers. "I knew Thomas," he said. "As well as anyone did, maybe. He wasn't a man who made himself easy to know." "Did you ever know him to talk about his land? About the South 40 in particular?" Earl's expression shifted slightly. It was a small shift, the kind that wouldn't register on a younger, less attentive face, but Jesse caught it. A compression around the eyes. A moment of something that was not quite surprise. "The difficult patch," Earl said. "He called it that. I know he did. Every farmer in the county knew that was what he called it, and wondered why he kept farming ground that consistently underperformed." Earl was quiet for a moment. Thomas was not a superstitious man. He was not sentimental. If he kept that patch when any reasonable farmer would have written it off, he had a reason. "I used to wonder about it. Never had a satisfying answer." "He did," Jesse said. And then, because he had decided on the drive into town that if he was going to have this conversation, he would have it honestly, he told Earl what he had found. Earl listened the way old men listen when they are hearing something they have half expected for a very long time. Not with shock, with a kind of settling, a confirmation of a suspicion that had been waiting at the edge of his understanding for decades. He did not interrupt. He did not make sounds of surprise. He folded his hands on the county atlas and listened until Jesse had finished, and then he was quiet for a long moment that Jesse had the patience to let run its course. When Jesse finished, Earl was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the county atlas. "Elias Marsh," he said finally. Jesse felt the air shift. "You knew the name." "I knew Marsh's business reputation. My father did business with one of his grain elevators before it failed." Earl looked at his hands on the atlas. "And I heard something once, in the way you hear things in a small county, from a man who had worked for Marsh in the 20s. He said Marsh had gold. A lot of gold. That when the crash came and Marsh's businesses went under, the gold just vanished. Creditors were furious, said he should have had assets sufficient to cover far more than he declared, but there was nothing to find, and he died before anyone could press him for answers." Earl reached past Jesse and pulled a worn reference volume from the shelf behind the work table. He opened it to a section of newspaper clippings preserved behind acetate and found the one he was looking for. A clipping from the Cimarron County Courier, dated December 1931. The headline read, "Local businessman Elias Marsh dies. Creditors seek estate assets." The article was short a half column and described a man of considerable local reputation whose death had left behind more debts than assets, and whose creditors were seeking an accounting of property and holdings that, in the words of the reporter, appeared substantially less than his known prosperity would suggest. 45 years I've had this clipping in this book," Earl said, closing it, "and never had a satisfying reason why Marsh's assets came up so short." He looked at Jesse across the work table. "Now I have one." He looked up at Jesse. "Your grandfather worked for Marsh." "I didn't know that specifically, but I knew Thomas came from that part of the state, and I knew he arrived here with very little visible money and managed to hold on to this land through conditions that broke every other small farmer in the county through the 30s and 40s. The droughts, the depression, the war years when inputs were rationed and prices were controlled. Every one of those decades should have finished him. None of them did. I never asked him directly how he managed it. It wasn't the kind of question you asked Thomas Calloway. He answered the questions you didn't ask and left alone the ones you did, and after 40 years of that pattern you stopped asking." Jesse sat with this for a moment. "Did my father know? Robert?" Earl shook his head slowly. "I don't believe so. Robert was a good man, but not a keeper of secrets. If he had known what was under that field, he would have told someone eventually, because that's who he was. Thomas knew that too. He left a letter. Said my father was meant for something else. That I was the one who would stay." Something softened in Earl's face. He was right about both things. Robert was never meant to be a farmer. He farmed because it was what he knew and the land was there. But his heart was elsewhere, and everyone who knew him could see it. "You." Earl looked at Jesse with the frank appraisal of a man who has been watching families repeat themselves across generations. "You are Thomas, without the secrets. Same hands, same stubbornness, same quality of attention to the land. He would have recognized you." Jesse drove home through the flat country of Harlan County with the morning sun full on the windshield and his grandfather's letter in his jacket pocket and the number of gold coins in a buried vault under his South 40 in his mind, turning slowly like a thing too large to look at directly. He drove past the Henderson property, now under Meridian management, its fields already plowed in the efficient parallel lines of large-scale corporate agriculture. No variation, no attention to the particular character of individual patches of ground. He drove past the county road that led to the Whitmore place where Earl's son farmed the same land his father had worked for 50 years. He drove past the grain elevator in Harlan where Thomas Calloway had sold his wheat for 40 years, the elevator's name long since changed from the family operation it had been to the corporate name it wore now, but the structure the same, the function the same, the land around it unchanged. He thought about Elias Marsh, a man who had spent 30 years converting paper prosperity into gold because he did not trust the institutions that held other men's wealth, and who had been proved right when those institutions collapsed in 1929, who had paid his most trusted employee in the only currency that had retained its value while everything else dissolved, who had died leaving his creditors frustrated and his debts unpaid, but who had also left, in the hands of a young man from Oklahoma with $40 and a determination to put down roots, the means to do exactly that. He thought about Thomas Calloway building the vault in the winter of 1935, working alone in the cold, carrying concrete by hand, shaping the forms, pouring in sections small enough for one man to manage. Doing it at night so the neighbors wouldn't ask what he was building. Sealing the door from the inside before he closed it for the last time, running the chains through the ring bolts, walking back up the stairs and covering the whole thing with soil and planting spring wheat above it in the morning. The secret his grandfather had carried for 40 years was not a shameful one. It was a practical one. Gold possession had been illegal from 1933 until 1974. Thomas had been holding property that, if discovered, could have been confiscated, that could have cost him the farm itself and potentially his freedom. He had kept quiet because silence was the only way to protect what Marsh had given him and what he had built above it. By 1974, when the law changed, Thomas was 66 years old. He had kept the secret for 40 years. His wife Ruth had died in 1971 without ever knowing. His son Robert was 43 and already showing the restlessness that would eventually lead him to sell the farm to Jesse rather than work it himself. Thomas had looked at the changed law and looked at his son and looked at the vault under the South 40 and made a decision that Jesse now understood with complete clarity. He had waited for Jesse. The foreclosure deadline was 60 days out. The loan balance was $412,000. The preliminary estimate Jesse had put together in his head, based on the coins he had seen and the number of crates he had counted, was a figure with 8 digits in it. 60 days was not long, but it was long enough if he moved right. When he pulled into the drive, Danny was waiting for him on the porch steps, still in his school clothes, but with his jacket on and the particular expression he used when he was trying to conceal urgency. "Carl Devereaux was here," Danny said. Jesse turned off the truck and sat still for a moment. "Devereaux drove up about an hour ago. I told him you weren't home. He asked if we'd been doing excavation work in the South 40. Said he could see the disturbed soil from the road." Jesse looked across the yard toward the equipment bay where the trouble lights extension cord was still coiled from the previous day's work. "What did you tell him?" "That we found a drainage problem. That you were doing drainage work." Jesse looked at his son. The controlled steadiness in Danny's voice, the decision he had made alone in the moment he was faced with it, the particular quality of loyalty that had come through in a situation that required it, and that Jesse had not been there to coach him through. "Good," Jesse said. "That was exactly right. He left his card," Danny said. "He said to tell you Meridian's offer is still open and that they could move quickly if you wanted to close before the bank deadline." Jesse took the business card Danny handed him and looked at it for a moment. The clean logo, the professional weight of the cardstock, the phone number for an office in Wichita. He set it on the truck's dashboard. "Did he go to the South 40? I watched from the porch. He drove to the end of the property road and stopped and looked for a while, then came back. He didn't get out of his truck at the field." "Okay." Jesse got out of the truck. "We need to move faster than I planned. Can you help me tonight?" Danny stood up from the porch steps. The distance he had been keeping, the carefully maintained space that had grown between them in the 2 years since Sarah died. The grief that had taken the shape of withdrawal had not disappeared. It wasn't going to disappear in 2 days of shared discovery. But something in it had shifted. Some arrangement had changed in the space between them. "Yeah," Danny said. "I can help." That evening, they went back down together with better equipment, a proper work light, a notebook, a camera. They moved through the underground room systematically, counting crates, opening and sampling the contents of containers, inventorying as much as they could in the 2 hours before the temperature underground drove them back up. Danny had brought a legal pad from his school bag and a ruler, and he worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had decided that the right response to an overwhelming situation was to start measuring it. He numbered each crate by its position in the stack, recorded the stack number, the crate number, the condition of the exterior, and whatever was visible when Jesse lifted the lid for a sample check. He was precise and systematic about it in a way that Jesse recognized from Sarah, the same quality of attention that she had brought to anything she decided deserved it. Jesse worked the pry bar on every 5th crate, taking a representative sample of the contents. The coins were consistent throughout, predominantly St. Gaudens double eagles, with a significant number of Liberty Head eagles, $10 gold pieces, equally beautiful, equally well preserved. and in 4 of the crates a layer of Morgan silver dollars wrapped separately, their larger faces gleaming in the work light, with the particular silver sheen of coins that have never circulated. The silver was less immediately valuable per coin than the gold, but Morgan dollars had their own collector market, and the pristine condition of these would count in their favor. The final count was 51 wooden crates. The preliminary sample from 4 additional crates confirmed that the contents were consistent oilcloth-wrapped packets of gold coins, predominantly St. Gaudens double eagles and Liberty eagles, mint dates ranging from 1880 through 1932, all pre-confiscation, all in preservation states that suggested they had been wrapped immediately after acquisition and not disturbed since. The metal containers held silver coin rolls, several bundles of early-century paper currency, and additional documents, ledgers, receipts, correspondence between Thomas and Elias Marsh spanning the years 1928 through 1931. The ledgers were the most valuable thing in the room that had no monetary value at all. They were Marsh's own records, kept in his hand, listing every coin purchase he had made over 30 years, the date, the mint, the denomination, the condition notes. It was a provenance document of extraordinary completeness. A record that traced every coin in those 51 crates back to its original purchase and legitimate ownership. In the hands of a skilled numismatist, those ledgers transformed the gold coins from found property of uncertain history into documented collection pieces of unambiguous provenance. Jesse sat on the concrete floor with the ledger open across his knees and tried to do the arithmetic of what he was holding, and found that the arithmetic would not cooperate, not because the numbers were too small, but because they were too large, because every estimate he made came out to a figure that was too far outside the range of his ordinary financial experience to feel real. The conservative number, based on the sample of coins he had seen and the number of crates in the room, was somewhere north of $40 million. The number, if the rarer dates and mint marks were present in the collection in anything like proportion, if Marsh had bought well across his 30 years of accumulation, was higher than that. $40 million. Jesse looked at that figure on the page of Danny's legal pad where Danny had written it in his mother's clear handwriting, and felt nothing for a moment. Not excitement, not relief, not the particular exhilaration that the movies suggest a person feels when they discover extraordinary wealth. What he felt was something quieter and more disorienting, the sudden groundlessness of a man who has spent years bracing against a weight that has now been removed, and who has not yet adjusted his posture to account for its absence. "Dad?" Danny said from across the room. "Are you okay?" Jesse looked up. Danny was watching him with an expression that was, for the first time in 2 years, entirely open. The wariness was gone. The careful, controlled distance was gone. He looked like himself, like the boy who had driven the tractor at 12 with that particular focused confidence, like the boy who had sat across the kitchen table asking questions about soil prep. "Yeah," Jesse said. "I'm okay." He looked at the page again. "I'm very okay." Jesse sat on the concrete floor of his grandfather's buried vault with the ledger open across his knees and understood, in a way that had not fully arrived yet, what Thomas Calloway had left him. Not just the gold, not just the coins or the silver or the rare currency. The whole thing together: the vault, the letter, the ledger, the documented provenance. The recorded history of how every piece had been acquired was a gift constructed with extraordinary care by a man who had spent 40 years thinking about how to leave it properly, who had understood that the difference between a fortune found and a fortune that could be used was documentation, who had kept Marsh's records not out of sentiment, but out of practicality, because he had known that someday someone would need to demonstrate where all of this had come from. His grandfather had thought of everything. Everything except the foreclosure deadline. Everything except the 60 days. Jesse closed the ledger and looked at the room around him, the columns and the walls and the rows of crates that held 3 generations of careful keeping, and felt the thing that had been building since he first climbed down these steps with the trouble light. The thing that was not quite hope, because hope is tentative, and this was not tentative. This was going to be all right. He didn't know yet how exactly. He didn't have the steps mapped in the right order. He needed an attorney and a numismatist, and probably a conversation with the county tax assessor. And he needed all of those things to happen before Carl Devereaux, or Ted Hargrove, or anyone else with a stake in his misfortune had reason to start asking questions about disturbed soil in the South 40. But it was going to be all right. He was the 3rd generation Calloway on this ground, and the first-generation Calloway to know what had been waiting under it all along. His grandfather had broken ground in the Dust Bowl and built something here in secret, and aimed it forward across time with the patience of a man who understood that some things take longer than a single life to complete. Jesse was here. The vault was here. The documentation was here. 60 days was not long, but it was long enough. He thought about the conversation he needed to have with Catherine Bremer, who handled agricultural law out of a Dodge City office and who had drawn up his original loan papers 15 years ago. He would call her in the morning, lay out the discovery, ask her what reporting requirements existed, and how to begin establishing proper legal title to a collection of this size. He thought about what he would say to Hargrove when the time was right. Not yet. Not until the appraisals were done and the legal process was started, and he held something more concrete than a flashlight and a notebook. He thought about Carl Devereaux and his clean truck and his carefully positioned offers, and what it would feel like to say no to all of it from a position of actual choice rather than exhausted obligation. He was not naive enough to think that the discovery solved every problem at once. There would be tax implications and legal process and appraisal costs and the inevitable complications that come with any significant windfall. But the fundamental situation, the farm, the land, the 412 acres that Thomas Calloway had broken from the Dust Bowl, was no longer at risk. That much he understood clearly, sitting on the concrete floor with the Marsh ledger on his knee and the work light humming and 51 crates of his grandfather's long patience arranged along the walls around him. He stood up, tucking the ledger under his arm. Danny was at the far end of the room, photographing the shelved alcove in the concrete wall that they had not fully examined yet. He had been methodical about it, moving from shelf to shelf with the phone's camera, documenting each section before touching anything. "Dad," Danny said, from the far end of the room. His voice carried a new note. Jesse crossed the floor. The alcove shelves held what the crates and containers had, not the smaller, denser category of things that a man puts away not because they need to be hidden, but because they need to be kept. There were tools, a compass, a surveyor's rule, a set of drawing instruments in a velvet-lined case. There were maps, rolled and bound, the paper fragile but intact under the painted sealant that had protected them. There were 2 framed photographs that Jesse had not noticed in his first visit, face down on the second shelf, which Danny had turned over and was now holding up to the work light. The first photograph was the same image Jesse had seen on the kitchen wall: Thomas standing in the wheat field in the late 40s, hat pushed back, looking toward the camera with that expression that was not quite a smile. But this was the original, not the copy. And it was larger. And in the lower right corner of this one, handwritten in the same careful script as the letter and the ledger, were 4 words that the kitchen copy did not have. "For the one who stays." The second photograph was one Jesse had never seen. It showed the South 40 in what appeared to be winter, the field bare and frozen, and in the center of the frame, standing above the excavation he had just sealed and covered, the steel door visible behind him, his coat dark with cold, was Thomas Calloway at perhaps 40 years old. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was entirely readable. Not satisfaction, not pride. Relief. The pure, bone-deep relief of a man who has finished something that needed finishing, who has put something away safely and can now rest. Jesse held the photograph in both hands and looked at his grandfather's face. The man in the photograph was 40 years old and had just finished a thing he had been working on for a winter's worth of cold nights. And the expression on his face was one that Jesse now understood completely. He had felt something close to it himself 2 days ago, climbing down a staircase into the dark with a trouble light and finding something extraordinary at the bottom of it. The recognition that a long piece of work had been properly done. The specific quality of relief that only comes after sustained, deliberate effort directed at something that matters. Thomas Calloway had not been a demonstrative man, by all accounts. He had not explained himself readily and had not sought to be understood in the ordinary social way. But he had been a man who expressed what he cared about through the quality of his work and the patience of his planning. And this photograph taken in the empty winter field, the sealed vault behind him, the whole patient arrangement ready to be covered by soil and left for the future, was the most expressive thing Jesse had ever seen. He felt his grandfather's presence in the room the way you feel the presence of someone who has shaped the place you stand in, through the arrangement of what they left behind. The columns, the crates, the carefully packed oilcloth packets, the Marsh ledger, The letter addressed to whoever finds this. All of it arranged not for display, but for use. For the person who would eventually come down these stairs and need it. Jesse looked at his grandfather's face in the photograph for a long time. Then he handed it to Danny and picked up the ledger and crossed to the staircase and climbed back up into the April night. Tomorrow there was work to do. Jesse called Catherine Bremer from the kitchen at 7 the next morning, before Danny was up, while the coffee was still brewing and the light outside was the particular pale gray of a Kansas spring morning that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it wants to be. Catherine picked up on the second ring. She was that kind of attorney, the kind who answered early calls, because the clients who called before 7 were usually the ones with genuine problems rather than questions that could wait. Jesse told her what he had found. He told her about the chain, the vault, the staircase, the crates, the coins, the Marsh ledger, and the letter from Thomas. He told her about the Elias Marsh history and the 1933 gold confiscation law, and the fact that the coins had been in continuous family-adjacent possession since their original legitimate purchase. He told her about Devereaux appearing at the property the previous afternoon, asking about excavation. Catherine listened without interrupting, the way she always did when a client was laying out a situation she needed to fully understand before she formed an opinion. When Jesse finished, she was quiet for a moment that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt longer. The legal situation is actually cleaner than you might expect, she said. Property found on your own land belongs to you under Kansas law. The gold confiscation order was rescinded in 1974, and the coins have been legal to hold since then. The Marsh provenance documentation is extraordinarily valuable from a title chain perspective. It establishes the original legitimate purchase and makes any competing ownership claim from Marsh's old creditors' estates essentially impossible to sustain at this remove. Those estates have been closed for decades. What about taxes? You'll owe federal capital gains on the fair market value at time of discovery. That's significant, but manageable against the total value if the appraisal confirms what you're describing. There are planning steps we can take before you liquidate anything that will substantially reduce the tax burden. She paused. Jesse, how conservative is your estimate of what's down there? He told her the number he and Danny had written on the legal pad. She was quiet for a longer moment this time. Jesse could hear, through the silence, the sound of a woman who had been practicing law in agricultural Kansas for 30 years and who had never heard a sentence quite like the one she had just heard, processing it against the available legal framework and the professional composure she had built over 3 decades. You need a numismatist, she said finally. A good one, someone with credentials from a major auction house who can provide a formal appraisal that will hold up to any scrutiny. I know someone at Heritage Auctions in Dallas who has dealt with pre-confiscation gold collections before. I'll make a call today. She paused once more, and Jesse heard something in the pause that he did not usually hear from Catherine Bremer, a quality of human response that her professional demeanor didn't quite contain. Jesse, she said, I'm very glad you called me. The numismatist Catherine arranged was a woman named Dr. Margaret Okafor, who drove up from Wichita 3 days later in a gray sedan with 2 colleagues and a set of equipment cases that she carried into the house with the careful handling of someone who was used to transporting precision instruments. She was in her early 50s, small and direct, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the particular quality of attention that specialists develop after decades of looking very carefully at specific things. She had been doing pre-confiscation gold appraisals for Heritage Auctions for 22 years. She did not make small talk. Jesse led her and her team across the South 40 to the excavation, which he and Danny had widened and shored properly in the days since the discovery, lining the walls of the opening with boards to prevent soil collapse and building a rough wooden frame around the staircase entrance. The work had been visible from the county road, and he had fielded 2 curious phone calls from neighbors who had driven past and wondered what was happening. He had told them drainage work, the same story Danny had given Devereaux, and the neighbors had accepted this because drainage problems in the South 40 were not a new topic. Dr. Okafor went down the stairs without comment, walked the room in a slow full circuit, and then stood at the center of it for a long moment looking at the crates. How long have these been here? She asked. Best estimate, since winter of 1935. She nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had been calculating. The oilcloth preservation is consistent with that. The paper packing around the packets is consistent. She crossed to the nearest open crate and crouched in front of it, examining the wrapped packets without touching them yet. Have you moved anything since the initial opening? Nothing beyond what I sampled for identification. 5 crates opened, 1 packet unwrapped from each. Good. She stood and turned to her colleagues, and they began to unpack the equipment case's magnification instruments, a portable scale, a humidity gauge, lighting equipment that produced a specific spectrum of illumination designed for coin examination. They worked for 6 hours. Jesse and Danny stayed out of the way once the appraisal was underway, sitting at the top of the stairs for most of the afternoon, coming down occasionally when Dr. Okafor had a question that required a landowner's answer. He watched her work in the way he watched all skilled specialists work, with the appreciation of a craftsman for another craftsman's method. She moved through the room with unhurried efficiency, touching nothing without purpose, recording everything in a notebook that she kept open in her left hand, while her right examined coins and cross-referenced the Marsh ledger and made small, precise notes. When she found something that warranted a second opinion, she called one of her colleagues over, and they consulted in low voices, their faces showing the controlled, professional response of people who have trained themselves not to react visibly to what their instruments tell them. She examined coins from all 51 crates, pulling representative samples with a systematic method she explained only briefly and then executed without further commentary. She consulted the Marsh ledger for an hour in the late afternoon, moving through its pages with the careful handling of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Twice she called one of her colleagues over and pointed to a specific entry, speaking in a low voice. Once she set the ledger down and stood still for a full minute with her hands at her sides, looking at the rows of crates, and Jesse could not read her expression from his position at the foot of the stairs, but he could read her stillness. It was the stillness of someone recalibrating. At 4:30, she came up the stairs with the ledger under her arm and her reading glasses on and sat down on the wooden frame Jesse had built around the staircase entrance. She took the glasses off and held them in her hands and looked out at the South 40 for a moment before she spoke. Jesse waited. Danny sat beside him without moving. The collection is primarily St. Gaudens double eagles, Liberty head eagles, and Morgan silver dollars. She began, speaking with the flat precision of someone who has learned to deliver assessments without embellishment, because embellishment is professionally inappropriate and also tends to make people not hear the actual numbers. Mint dates range from 1879 through 1932. The condition throughout is exceptional. I have not seen a large pre-confiscation hoard in this state of preservation in 22 years of doing this work. The oilcloth and dry conditions have been essentially perfect for long-term preservation. She looked at him directly. The Marsh ledger is the single most important document in the room. It provides a continuous provenance chain for virtually every coin in this collection, traceable to legitimate commercial purchase over a 30-year period. For auction purposes, that provenance turns already exceptional coins into documented historical collection pieces, which adds a meaningful premium across the board. Buyers at the highest level of the numismatic market will pay substantially more for coins with this quality of paper trail than for equivalent coins of uncertain origin. She named a range, a low estimate and a high estimate, separated by a span of several $1 million, depending on how individual auction performance went. The low estimate was $43 million. The high estimate was $61 million. Jesse sat with those numbers for a moment. He had been braced for them, had been doing his own rough arithmetic for days, but hearing them stated in a specialist's flat professional voice in the April afternoon light above the South 40 of the Calloway farm was still different from having them in his own head. They became, in her mouth, a fact of the world rather than an estimation. $43 million. He had lived his entire adult life on a farm that had never cleared more than $200,000 in a good year. He had been facing the loss of 412 acres at a bank auction 60-some days from now. His grandfather had bought this land for $40 in 1933 and built a vault under it in the winter of 1935 and planted wheat above it in the spring of 1936 and farmed it until he died in 1979 without ever spending a cent of what was in it. Danny, sitting beside him, said nothing. He was looking at his hands. The Marsh ledger alone, Dr. Okafor added, would be a significant donation to a museum or historical institution, should you choose to go that route with it. Heritage Auctions would be very interested in handling the coin collection, and I would recommend that approach for maximum realization. We have the buyer network for pre-confiscation gold of this quality and provenance. She handed Jesse the Marsh ledger and stood up. You should speak to your attorney before making any decisions about timing or disposition. Given the documentation and your clear title to the property, the auction process would be straightforward, but there are tax planning steps worth taking before you proceed. She looked out at the South 40 one more time, the turned soil, the distant fence line, the flat horizon that ran to the edge of the sky. Your grandfather kept this well, she said. It was the most personal thing she had said all day, and she said it without particular sentiment, just as a professional observation from someone who had spent her career assessing things that people had kept and things that people had not kept. Then she and her colleagues packed their equipment and drove away down the county road. Jesse and Danny sat on the wooden staircase frame in the April evening and let the numbers settle. 43 million at the low end. The foreclosure deadline was now 55 days away. The loan balance was $412,000. The gap between what he owed and what was sitting under the ground he was sitting on was a figure that still refused, in some part of Jesse's understanding, to connect itself fully to the reality of his circumstances. It was too large a shift, too complete a reversal, from the edge of losing everything to the other kind of edge entirely. But it was real. He had the appraisal. He had the attorney. He had the documentation. He had what Thomas Calloway had spent 40 years making sure he would have. What do we do first? Danny asked. Jesse looked at the field around them, the long gold of the late afternoon light across the turned soil, the cedar tree visible on the north rise against the darkening sky. We call the bank, he said. The call to Ted Hargrove went differently than any conversation Jesse had previously had with the man. Hargrove was in his Dodge City office when Jesse reached him, mid-morning on a Thursday, for days after the appraisal. Jesse had spent those 4 days working through the preliminary steps. Catherine had outlined the formal legal establishment of the find, the tax planning consultation, the paperwork for the auction consignment agreement that Heritage would need. He had done all of this quietly, without telling anyone beyond Catherine and Earl, who had been sworn to discretion with the gravity of a man who understood very clearly what was at stake. He told Hargrove that he intended to pay the loan in full. Hargrove said, "In full?" "Yes." A pause. "Mr. Reynolds, the full balance including the accelerated repayment schedule is I know the balance, Ted." Another pause, longer. Jesse could hear the quality of the silence on the other end of the line change, a recalibration happening in real time. "I see." Hargrove's voice had shifted from the controlled condescension Jesse had been the recipient of for 3 years to something more careful and less assured. "May I ask how you're planning to fund this?" "You may not," Jesse said pleasantly. "You'll have the wire instructions from my attorney by end of business Friday. I'll need written confirmation of the lien release by the following Wednesday." He ended the call before Hargrove could find his footing. He sat in the kitchen for a moment after, in the chair where Hargrove had sat in January, and said somebody will farm it, and felt something release in his chest that had been tight for so long he had forgotten what its absence felt like. Carl Devereaux came back 10 days later. He drove up the property road in the same clean truck, wearing the same carefully rural-adjacent clothing, with the same practiced ease of a man who expected to be in control of the conversation he was about to have. Jesse was in the yard when the truck pulled in, working on the fence gate that had been sticking since the winter, and he did not stop what he was doing when Devereaux got out and walked across the yard toward him. "Mr. Calloway." Devereaux's tone was the same, the measured confidence, the hint of inevitability in the vowels. "I wanted to follow up on my last visit. I understand there's been some activity on the South 40. "Drainage work," Jesse said, without looking up from the gate hinge. "Of course." Devereaux paused. "Look, I'll be direct with you. I know the bank situation. Our offer is still the best option you have, and Meridian is prepared to move quickly. We can close before the foreclosure deadline if you want to avoid. The foreclosure's been resolved." Devereaux stopped. Jesse looked up from the gate hinge. He looked at Devereaux's face, which was doing the same recalibration he had heard in Hargrove's voice on the phone, the same shift from confident expectation to uncertain ground, the same reaching for footing that was no longer where it had been. "The loan is paid," Jesse said. "The lien's been released. The farm is clear." Devereaux's expression passed through several stages in a short period of time. Disbelief first, then calculation, then the professional composure reasserting itself over both. I see. He looked around the yard, the equipment bay, the grain bins, the farmhouse, the South 40 visible in the distance. Well, if your situation changes, it won't, Jesse said. He went back to the gate hinge. After Devereaux's truck had gone, Jesse set down the wrench and straightened up and looked at the South 40 from the yard. The field was quiet under the morning sky. The staircase frame was still in place at the field's center, though most of the excavation work was done now. The vault sealed again, the exterior structure reinforced, the access properly framed for the ongoing appraisal team visits that would be needed before the auction. The farm had been in his family for 90 years. It would remain in his family. That was a sentence Jesse had not been able to say with confidence for 3 years, and saying it now, even just in his own mind, felt like a weight lifted from a structure that had been under load for so long. The relief was physical. Word did not stay contained for long. In a county of 12,000 people, the kind of quiet that Jesse had been attempting was always going to have a half-life. Earl Whitmore, despite his promise of discretion, was 89 years old and had been keeping secrets since before Jesse's father was born, and the particular secret of what lay under the Calloway South 40 had apparently reached a threshold of containment difficulty that even Earl's considerable self-discipline could not sustain indefinitely. It started, as things tend to start in small counties, with a look. While Brant at the feed store gave Jesse one, when he came in for seed corn, a look that lasted a beat too long and carried more weight than a hardware transaction warranted. 2 days later, Gary Henderson called. Then the Methodist pastor. Then Beverly Crane at the county library, who had known Jesse since he was 6 years old and who called to tell him that the Historical Society was very grateful and that she'd love to see him for coffee whenever he had a chance, and said it with the particular warmth of someone who means considerably more than the literal words. The county was talking. The shape and content of what they were talking about shifted with each retelling, as things always do in close communities. By the time it had gone through its first full circuit, the vault had grown, and the amount had expanded, and the historical significance had been elaborated in ways that were approximately accurate in character, if imprecise in detail. The coins became treasure. The vault became a legendary structure that people reconstructed in their imaginations with varying degrees of fidelity to what Jesse had actually described. The Elias Marsh story spread through Harlan County the way old local history always spreads when someone gives it a new current quickly, with additions, but keeping its essential shape. What did not shift, in any of the versions that reached Jesse's ears, was the response of the community toward him. Gary Henderson called back a second time and apologized. Not for encouraging Jesse to sell. Gary had meant that in genuine kindness, and Jesse knew it, but for what the advice had implicitly conceded, that the land was not worth holding, that the Calloway farm's time had run out. He said, "My dad would have been ashamed of me for saying it. The Calloway ground is Calloway ground. That wasn't mine to say." His voice had the particular quality of a man in his late 40s who has grown up enough to be embarrassed by things he said at 44. Jesse told him there was nothing to apologize for, and meant it. 3 other neighbors called in the same week, each in their own way circling back to earlier conversations and adjusting their positions in the quiet way that decent people do when circumstances have revealed that they were measuring the wrong things. Old Frank Riley, who had farmed the section to the south for 40 years, and who had said nothing directly, but whose silence had carried its own kind of verdict, stopped Jesse in the parking lot of the hardware store and shook his hand for a longer time than a handshake usually lasts, and said, Thomas would be satisfied. Frank was 74 and had known Thomas personally, and the words carried weight that Jesse felt for days afterward. Hargrove did not call. Jesse did not expect him to. Devereaux sent a brief email through Meridian's corporate address, complimenting Jesse on the successful resolution of your financial situation in the careful language of someone who wants to keep a door open for future transactions. Jesse read it once and filed it under the category of things he did not need to reply to. There was one more response that arrived by a route Jesse hadn't anticipated. A week after the news had fully settled into the county's awareness, he received a handwritten letter from an address in Cimarron, a woman named Louise Marsh, who identified herself as Elias Marsh's great-grandniece and the informal keeper of what remained of the Marsh family history. She had heard about the discovery through regional news coverage that had reached the Cimarron paper. She wrote that she had grown up with the story of the missing gold to family version, which characterized Elias as a man who had hidden his wealth from creditors he believed were corrupt, and that had always included the suggestion that a trusted employee had carried it away. She wrote without accusation. She wrote, in fact, with a generosity that stopped Jesse when he read it. She wrote that she was glad it had ended up where it did, that her family had never needed it, that from what she had heard of the Calloways in this story, it had gone to the right people. Jesse wrote back the same day, a short letter, 2 paragraphs, thanking her for the grace of what she had written and telling her that if she ever came through western Kansas, the door was open. He did not know if she would ever come, but it felt right to have said it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The morning Jesse went up to the cedar tree to tell Sarah, the light was the particular gold of late May, the wheat on the north field already ankle-high and running green and silver in the wind the way wheat does when the spring has been wet enough and the timing has been right. He climbed the low rise slowly, carrying his coffee the way he always did, feeling the give of the soil under his boots from the previous night's rain. The cedar had put on good growth this past year, its dark branches dense and fragrant, its roots spread wide in the mound beneath it. He had planted it as a sapling, and it was now, 5 years on, a proper tree, solid and evergreen and permanent in the way that cedars are, one of those plants that once established does not ask much and does not leave. He stood beside it and looked out over the farm. The wheat was coming up on the north field and the east field both. The south 40 was fully turned and would be planted later in the season, once the documentation work was complete and the appraisal team had finished their final survey of the vault's contents. He had decided not to plant above the vault again, not out of superstition, but because the South 40 deserved something different now, something that acknowledged what it was rather than treating it as ordinary ground. He had been thinking about a perennial grass restoration or a small orchard, something that would last without requiring the kind of annual attention that a working crop field demanded. He told Sarah about the chain, about the staircase and the crates and the coins wrapped in oilcloth since 1935, about Thomas's letter and the way the capital letters matched the ones on the kitchen wall photograph, about Earl Whitmore and the 1931 newspaper clipping he had kept for 45 years, about Danny opening the first crate and doing the arithmetic in his head faster than Jesse had. He told her about Hargrove's silence on the phone when Jesse said the loan was paid in full. He told her about Devereaux's face when he said the farm was clear. He told her about Danny wanting to study soil science and come back. The wind moved through the cedar branches above him and across the wheat fields below, and the meadowlarks were calling out along the fence lines, multiple birds, several voices overlapping in the spring morning air. The sky was deep and clear and immeasurably wide in the way that only a flat country sky can be, the horizon in every direction an unbroken line where the earth met the light. Jesse did not cry. He had done most of his crying in the first year, the year he had driven out here in the cold mornings and stood by the tree and talked to the absence of her and felt the cold and the grief as the same kind of thing, bone deep and everywhere at once. What he felt now was something different, something that was grief still, in the way that grief is never fully past, but that had a quality of resolution in it that the earlier grief had not. He had stayed. He had stayed on the land she had loved, in the house she had shaped, near the grave where she could see the wheat come up each spring. He had held the farm together through conditions that had broken better-funded operations. And Thomas Calloway, a man neither of them had known except through old photographs and older stories, had built something under the ground specifically for the person who would stay. And that person had turned out to be Jesse. She would have understood that. She had always understood, better than Jesse himself, the particular value of staying in a place and working it properly and trusting that what you put into the ground would eventually come back up. That had been one of the fundamental things about Sarah, her patience with land and with people, her refusal to discount things that hadn't yet shown their value. He thought about how she would have responded to seeing the coins. She would have found Thomas's letter first and read it standing at the bottom of the stairs in the vault's cold air, and she would have been quiet for a long time afterward, and then she would have said something exact and simple that cut to the center of it. She had that gift. Jesse had depended on it more than he had ever told her, had assumed it would always be available to him. He had been talking to the cedar tree for 3 years now instead, and it was not the same thing and never would be, but it was not nothing either. It was a way of keeping the conversation going in the only direction it could go now, outward, toward the ground and the sky, into the air of the farm that had been hers as much as his. He stood at the cedar tree until the coffee was cold. Then he walked back down the rise and went to work. There was always work to do. That had not changed. The farm still needed tending, and the seasons still turned on their axis regardless of what was discovered beneath the surface or how many millions sat in a heritage auction's holding account in Kansas City. The east fence needed 3 new posts after the winter. The grain drill needed its disc bearings checked before the late summer planting. The cattle needed their fall vaccination scheduled. The list was the same list it had always been, the permanent running account of a working farm, and Jesse went through it the way he had gone through it every year of his adult life, with the steady, unremarkable persistence that farming requires of people who mean to keep doing it. The difference was that he did these things now without the low, constant pressure of imminent loss that had been his background condition for 3 years. That pressure had been so pervasive, so much the atmospheric condition of every day, that its absence was almost disorienting. He caught himself, occasionally, performing the anxious mental arithmetic that had become habitual. The loan balance calculation, the yield projection, the gap between what he had and what he owed, and then catching himself doing it and stopping, because the numbers had changed and the habit had not quite caught up yet. That would come. The new reality would become ordinary in its own time. Danny's last week of school coincided with the first auction consignment packing, which Heritage Auctions conducted on-site with a team of 7 specialists who arrived in 2 vehicles and spent 4 days in the vault cataloging and carefully packaging individual lots for transport. Jesse watched most of this from above ground, coming down only when his presence was required, which suited him. The vault had been his grandfather's space for a long time and would be an auction house's space briefly, and would then be something else afterward, something he hadn't entirely decided yet, and he was content to let the process proceed without his hovering. Danny, on the last day of the packing operation, asked if he could talk to one of the specialists about the documentation process. The specialist, a young man named Prescott who had studied numismatics at the University of Illinois, spent 40 minutes explaining the cataloging methodology while Danny took notes on his legal pad with the same systematic attention he had brought to the initial inventory. Afterward, Danny told Jesse that Prescott had said the Marsh ledger was the finest provenance document he had personally encountered in 4 years of doing auction preparation. He said most collections this age have fragmentary provenance at best, Danny said. Great-grandfather keeping those records all those years, that's the thing that makes the whole collection what it is. He was a careful man, Jesse said. Yeah. Danny looked at the South 40, the staircase frame still visible in the field center. I've been thinking about what I want to study. Jesse waited. Environmental science, Danny said. Specifically soil science and groundwater systems. There's a program at Kansas State. He looked at his father sideways. I was thinking I'd go for 4 years and come back. Jesse absorbed this. Come back to the farm? If there's still a farm to come back to. Danny said it with a slight upward inflection that might have been a question or might have been a test, checking whether the answer he expected was the one he was going to get. There's a farm, Jesse said. There's always going to be a farm. Danny nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been confirmed that he had needed confirmed. He went back to his notes. Jesse stood in the yard for a long time after Danny went inside, listening to the sound of the appraisal team moving equipment in the field behind him and the meadowlarks and the wind. He thought about Sarah and what she would have made of the past 3 months. She had been a person who understood intuitively what others had to work hard to understand, the difference between things that mattered and things that seemed to matter. She had never been impressed by the idea of the farm as property or as financial instrument. What she had loved was the specific and concrete reality of it. The smell of the soil after rain, the way the light moved across the wheat at different hours of the day, the particular sound the old John Deere made when it was running well versus when it needed attention. The particular, present, tangible fact of the place. She would have stood in the vault at the bottom of the staircase and looked at the 51 crates and felt the cold, dry air and said something quiet and precise that got to the center of it faster than Jesse had managed in 3 months of processing. He still didn't know exactly what she would have said. He thought maybe something about Thomas. About what it means to build something for someone else, for a person who doesn't exist yet, a specific future person you can imagine but have never met. He thought about Thomas Calloway building the vault in the winter of 1935 and planting wheat above it in the spring. He thought about Robert farming above it for 30 years without knowing. He thought about his own 40 years on this ground, the years before Sarah's death and the years after, the drought and the debt and the 90-day notice and the April morning that had changed everything. He thought about the things you put into the ground and what comes back up. The first auction results came in on a Tuesday in July, 6 weeks after the consignment. Catherine called him from her Dodge City office at 9 in the morning, and Jesse was on the tractor in the east field when the call came, and he cut the engine and sat in the sudden quiet of the field to listen. The first lot 200 St. Gaudens double eagles, including several key dates from the 1927 Philadelphia Mint, had sold for $4.3 million. The second lot, Liberty Head Eagles across a range of mint marks and dates, had gone for $2.7 million. The third lot, the Morgan Silver Dollars, had cleared $1.8 million. The Marsh Ledger, offered separately as a historical document to a consortium of numismatic museums and the Smithsonian Institution, had sold for $340,000. $9.1 million from the first 3 lots alone. There were 22 more lots scheduled across the following months. Jesse thanked Catherine, ended the call, and sat on the tractor in the east field for a long time without starting the engine. The wheat around him was taller now, the June growth heavy and bending slightly in the morning wind. The sky was the deep, clear blue of a Kansas summer day that has not yet committed to heat, still fresh in the early morning, the light coming in flat and golden across the tops of the grain. He thought about the morning in January when Hargrove had sat at the kitchen table and said somebody will farm it. He thought about it not with anger. The anger had burned itself out some time ago, leaving behind a kind of clarity in its place, but with a simple appreciation for how completely wrong that sentence had been. Not maliciously wrong, just wrong in the way that people are wrong when they look at a situation and see only what's visible on the surface and assume that is all there is. The South 40 had always underperformed. The soil compaction, the drainage issues, the consistent yields that ran 30% below comparable ground. Every agronomist who had ever looked at that field had pointed to its clay content and its poor structure and called it marginal land. They had been measuring the right things in the wrong layer. The thing that made the South 40 what it was had not been visible in any soil sample. It had been 80 feet down, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed behind a steel door, and waiting since the winter of 1935 for exactly the right April morning to announce itself. Jesse started the tractor and went back to work. The chain was in the barn. He had pulled it from the plow blade on the morning of the discovery, coiled it carefully, and hung it on the barn wall between the old grain scoop and the framed photograph of Thomas that had come down from the kitchen wall after Jesse had the original, from the vault shelves, properly restored and reframed. The chain hung there now in the way that things hang in barns without ceremony, without a label, just an object in its place, and Jesse walked past it every day on his way in and out, and sometimes stopped to look at it. It was not beautiful. It was 40 pounds of hand-forged iron that had sat in the ground for 90 years and bore the rust and compression of that tenure across every link. It was the most ordinary-looking thing in the barn. A person who didn't know its story would see old chain and nothing else. Jesse saw the morning he had climbed down from the tractor to look at what had snagged the blade. The specific quality of that April light. The cold on his hands. The way he had stood there in the wind that always comes off the Kansas plains with somewhere to be, and looked at the chain for a long time, and understood, in some part of himself that worked below the level of conscious reasoning, that something had been put here deliberately by human hands, that it had been waiting. He thought sometimes about how close the margin had been. If the South 40 had been left fallow another year, the chain would have waited another year. If the foreclosure had proceeded before the discovery, the land would have been sold, and the new owner, Meridian Land Holdings, almost certainly would eventually have found the vault during their own site work. Thomas Calloway's careful decades of keeping would have enriched a corporate portfolio rather than the family it was aimed at. If Jesse had taken Devereaux's first offer 18 months ago, before the debt had gotten critical enough to make the foreclosure imminent, he would have walked away with enough money to start over somewhere else. But the vault would not have been his. The timing had been exact. The margin had been the width of a single planting season. Thomas, who had aimed this discovery across 40 years, could not have planned for the specific crisis that made Jesse the right person in the right place in the right spring. But maybe he had understood something more general, that the kind of person who would stay through conditions that drove others off was also the kind of person who would keep going until the ground gave up what it was holding. Jesse stood in the barn doorway on a late August evening, looking out at the South 40 in the long, low light of a Kansas summer sunset, and thought about his grandfather standing in this same yard, looking at this same field, carrying this same knowledge. The grain on the South 40, the section he had decided to plant after all, the sections far enough from the vault to be worked without interference, was heading out in the evening wind. The tassels caught the last light and moved in slow unison, the whole field breathing in the rhythm of grain in its final push before harvest. Behind him in the barn, the chain hung on the wall beside the photograph of Thomas Calloway. Ahead of him, the South 40 stretched to the fence line, and beyond it the county road, and beyond that the flat country that ran to the horizon and dissolved into the enormous Kansas sky. There were things his grandfather had never gotten to tell him. Things about the vault and the coins and the 30 years of careful maintenance and the specific cold nights of the winter of 1935 when the concrete was poured and the steel door was set. Things about Elias Marsh and the extraordinary trust that had been placed in a 23-year-old farm hand who had simply shown up every day and worked and been reliable. Things about the decision, in 1974, when gold possession became legal again and Thomas was 66 years old and could have ended the secret and chosen not to. Jesse would never know all of those things. What he had was the letter and the photograph and the vault and the 4 words that said, "For the one who stays." It was enough. It was more than enough. The west sky was deep orange now, fading through pink to the darkening blue above, and the first star was showing above the eastern horizon. Down in the field, a meadowlark sang the last song of the day. Jesse listened to it until it stopped and the evening settled fully into itself, and then he turned and went back into the barn and switched off the light. In the morning, there was work to do. There was always work to do, and the difference between this morning and the morning of April the 8th was not that the work had changed. The land still needed tending. The machinery still needed maintaining. The seasons still turned on their axis regardless of what was discovered beneath the surface. The difference was that the farm was his, the way his grandfather had intended it to be his, and his son was coming back to it after 4 years of college. And the cedar tree on the north rise was growing strong above the woman who had loved this ground as much as Jesse did. And somewhere in the South 40 a staircase descended into the earth, and at the bottom of it sat the concrete room where Thomas Calloway had kept faith with the future across 4 decades of silence and spring plantings. And careful, steady, ordinary days. Jesse had made one decision about the vault that he had not yet told many people. He was not going to seal it. The heritage auction would run for another 8 months. When it was done, the vault would be empty of its coins and documents, its practical purpose complete, its financial function fulfilled. Jesse could have filled it with soil or broken up the concrete and let the field absorb it. That was the practical option. That was what you would do with an underground structure that no longer served a function. Instead, he was going to clean it and light it and put a proper entrance in the South 40 surface, framed and level and permanent, and leave it as it was. A poured concrete room, 80 years old and sound, with its ringbolt chain anchors still in the walls and its shelved alcove and its 8-foot columns standing as they had always stood. He was going to put a plaque on the wall with Thomas's words from the letter, the ones about things being built for the future, for the ones who stay, and he was going to let Danny's soil science students from Kansas State come down and look at it when Danny brought them out. And he was going to let anyone from the county who wanted to see it come and look. Because it was history. Because the story of a 23-year-old Oklahoma farm hand who had been trusted with something extraordinary and had built it into a legacy across 40 years of silent keeping was a story that belonged to this county and this county's people. Because Thomas Calloway had not just left his grandson money. He had left him an example of what it looks like when a person decides what matters and then just quietly, without fanfare, without anyone watching, does the work of preserving it. Earl Whitmore had cried when Jesse told him about the vault being kept open. Not conspicuously, Earl was not a man who cried conspicuously, but Jesse had been watching his face, and he had seen it. the brief brightness in the old man's eyes before his composure reasserted itself, and he looked away toward the county atlas on the shelf and cleared his throat. "Thomas," Earl had said, after a moment, in the tone of someone settling a long account, would have thought that was exactly right. He had also accepted, on behalf of the Harlan County Historical Society, a contribution of $250,000 that Jesse and Catherine had structured through a charitable foundation. The money would fund the organization's digitization project, which had been stalled for 3 years for lack of funds, and would allow the society to properly preserve and make accessible the Marsh Calloway documents that were not included in the heritage auction, the personal correspondence, the survey records, the family letters that told the human story behind the financial one. Earl had sat with the check in his hands for a long moment before he put it in the society's file drawer. Then he had looked at Jesse and said, "This county has been forgetting itself for 30 years. This might help it remember." Jesse drove home from that conversation the long way, through the county roads that ran past the Henderson place and the Riley ground and the old Whitmore farm where Earl's son now ran the operation. And he looked at the country he had lived in his whole life with the particular quality of attention you bring to things you have nearly lost and been given back. The flat fields under the summer sky, the grain elevators at the county road intersections catching the late afternoon light on their metal sides. The old farmstead, some occupied, some abandoned, some absorbed into the larger corporate operations that had been reshaping the county's character for a generation, each one a chapter in the same long story of people trying to hold on to ground. He thought about Thomas Calloway, 20 years old, driving north from Cimarron in the November dark with 16 crates on a wagon bed and $40 in his pocket and no plan beyond the one he was making as he went. He thought about what it takes to do something like that, not the practical courage, but the deeper kind, the willingness to make a decision alone in the dark and live with it for 40 years without external validation, without the comfort of being understood. Jesse Calloway was not Thomas Calloway. He was different in ways that mattered, more willing to ask for help, more inclined to tell Danny the truth about hard things, better than his grandfather had apparently been at letting people close enough to matter. But he had the same bones underneath, the same quality of attention to the land, the same stubbornness that the county had always called a Calloway trait and that had turned out, in this particular case, to be the trait that saved everything. He had stayed when leaving made more sense. He had worked the South 40 one more time when 4 years of underperformance made a reasonable case for leaving it fallow. And the chain had come up. Jesse Calloway had come to this land in the same posture his grandfather had come to it, with not much left and a determination that would have to substitute for resources until the resources came. He had stayed when it would have been easier and more rational to leave. He had worked ground that consistently underperformed. He had gotten up before dawn on a Tuesday in April with nothing particular to hope for and gone out to do one more thing on one more morning. And the ground had given back. That was the thing about land. That was the thing Thomas Calloway had understood when he broke ground in the Dust Bowl, that his son Robert had never fully grasped, that Jesse had learned in the bone-deep way you learn things that take a whole life to teach. The land gives back. Not always on the schedule you need, not always in the form you expected, not always in time for the crisis you are currently in. But to the person who stays, who keeps working the difficult patches and doesn't walk away when the logic of walking away is overwhelming to that person, eventually, the ground gives back. Jesse walked up the rise to the cedar tree in the last of the August light and stood there with his cold coffee and looked out at the farm his grandfather had built and his father had worked and he had held and would now pass on. The meadowlark had gone quiet for the night. The grain on the South 40 moved in the evening wind, the heads bowing slightly under their own weight, ready for harvest in another 10 days. The stars were coming up, one by one, over the long flat country of western Kansas, each one appearing where it had always appeared, patient and bright, and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas played out below them. He had stood under this same sky in January with the foreclosure notice in his hand and felt the ground shifting under him. He stood under it now and felt it solid and his and continuing. The way good ground continues, the way a farm that has survived the worst weather a century can produce continues, not unchanged, never unchanged, but present, alive, responsive to the person willing to keep working it. Thomas Calloway had planted his first crop in 1936 above a secret that would take 3 generations to surface. He had done this in the faith that the right person would eventually come along and know what to do with what he had hidden. He had been right. Jesse Calloway looked at all of it for a long time: the fields, the sky, the cedar tree, the distant grain bins catching the last light. Then he walked back down the hill. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.